It's been 3 years since I last set foot in Firewatch Tower number 6, perched like a skeletal finger on the windswept crest of Widow's Grief Ridge. But last night, I dreamed of it again, and I woke up screaming. The thing is, I wasn't screaming because of what happened in the dream. I was screaming because when I opened my eyes, I swear I could still hear the knocking. Slow, deliberate, methodical, coming from my bedroom wall. The same rhythm that haunted me through that endless night 3 years ago. Knock, knock, knock. Like something patient and terrible had followed me home and was finally ready to finish what it started. People think being a park ranger is about handing out trail maps to lost hikers, telling teenagers to keep their beer hidden from park supervisors, and maybe shouting at the occasional bear that's gotten too comfortable around the campgrounds. And yeah, sometimes it is exactly that mundane. But when you're assigned to a Firewatch tower, one of the old ones, built back in the 1940s before cell service was even a fantasy, before GPS could tell you exactly where you were when the world went wrong, you learn quickly that you're not just watching for smoke rising from the forest canopy. You're watching for everything. Every shadow that moves wrong. Every sound that doesn't belong. Every feeling that crawls up your spine when the sun goes down and the wilderness shows its true face. Tower number 6 sits alone like a forgotten monument, miles from the nearest access road, up on Widow's Grief Ridge where the wind never stops howling and the trees grow twisted and wrong. The place has history. The kind of history people put in local legends, books with faded photographs and sell at gas stations to tourists who think they want to know the truth about the places they're visiting. Rangers don't talk about those stories on duty, because once you start sharing what you've heard, what you've seen, what keeps you awake during the long watches, the night shift gets a lot harder. Some knowledge is better left buried. The night I was stationed there, it was supposed to be a simple storm watch. Lightning was rolling in from the west like God's own artillery barrage, and the wind was cutting through the ancient pines in long, mournful waves that sounded almost like voices if you listened too carefully. My radio kept cutting in and out, spitting bursts of static between the occasional dispatch check-in from base station Charlie down in the valley. Standard equipment failure for the old towers. Nothing to worry about. I'd settled in for what I expected to be a routine evening, coffee from my thermos, a paperback novel I'd been meaning to finish, and the comfortable rhythm of monitoring weather patterns on instruments that were probably older than I was. The storm was still hours away, and I had time to get familiar with Tower number 6's particular quirks and creaks. That's when, at exactly 9:42 p.m. according to my watch, I saw something moving just beyond the tree line at the edge of Devil's Clearing. It wasn't a hiker, no headlamp, no reflective gear, and no one in their right mind would be out here with a storm coming in. It wasn't an animal either. I've seen enough deer, elk, and even the occasional black bear to know how they move, how they hold themselves, how they react to sudden light or sound. This thing was standing still. Too still. Motionless in a way that felt deliberate, purposeful. And it was facing directly toward me, toward Tower number 6, like it had been waiting for me to notice it. I lifted my binoculars, thinking maybe it was a downed branch caught in an odd position, or a trick of the approaching rain clouds and shifting shadows. The forest plays games with your eyes, especially when you're tired and the light is failing. But the moment I brought the lenses to my eyes and focused on that motionless figure, it smiled. Not the kind of smile you see on a human face. This was something else entirely. Too wide. Too knowing. Too hungry. That was the moment I knew my shift in Tower number 6 wasn't going to end normally. That was the moment everything changed, and I stepped across a line I didn't even know existed. The storm outside didn't roar so much as it breathed, long, slow gusts that made the old tower groan and sway like an ancient ship adrift on a sea of wind and rain. The metal framework sang in frequencies that seemed to burrow into your bones, creating a symphony of unease that made concentration impossible. Rain pinged off the metal roof in uneven bursts, sometimes like fingertips tapping impatiently against glass, sometimes like handfuls of gravel flung from the sky by an invisible hand. Each drop seemed to carry its own message, its own warning that I was too slow to understand. The figure hadn't moved since I first spotted it in Devil's Clearing. Even in the erratic flashes of lightning that illuminated the landscape in stark black and white, I could see the outline clearly now, impossibly long limbs that seemed to bend at wrong angles, a thin frame that suggested something that had once been human but had forgotten how, and a head tilted just slightly to the left, like it was curious about something it saw in Tower Number 6. Like it was studying me the same way I was studying it. I forced myself to look away from the binoculars and reached for the radio, my hand steadier than I felt. "Tower 6 to Base Station Charlie," I said, keeping my voice level and professional. "I've got a possible trespasser in the west quadrant, maybe a quarter-mile out in Devil's Clearing. Could be a hiker caught in the weather." The response came back through layers of static and interference, fragmented and barely intelligible. "Say again, Tower 6. You're breaking up badly, repeat your message." I tried again, speaking slower and louder, but the line dissolved into pure white noise that seemed to mock my attempts at communication. The storm was getting stronger, and the old radio equipment wasn't designed to handle this level of atmospheric interference. I lowered the radio and reached for the binoculars again, telling myself that when I looked through them this time, I'd see nothing but trees and shadows and my own overactive imagination. The clearing was empty. Now, if you've spent any significant time in the backcountry, you know exactly how easy it is for shadows and branches and tricks of light to play games with your mind. One second you're looking at a stump and your heart is racing because you think it's a bear, the next second the wind shifts and you realize you've been staring at a perfectly innocent piece of dead wood. It happens to everyone. It's part of the job. Your brain is wired to see threats where none exist, because in the wilderness, the cost of missing a real threat can be your life. I told myself that's all this was. Tired eyes, atmospheric pressure from the approaching storm, too much coffee and not enough sleep. Standard rookie mistakes. Still, I locked the door to the tower cabin. Just in case. By 10:15, I'd almost convinced myself I imagined the whole thing. I'd made another pot of coffee, tried the radio twice more with no success, and settled back into the routine of monitoring instruments and watching the storm approach Widow's Grief Ridge. The lightning was getting closer, the thunder more frequent, and I could feel the electricity in the air making my skin crawl and my hair stand on end. Then the radio hissed again, but instead of the familiar voice of Base Station Charlie's night dispatcher, I heard something that made my blood freeze in my veins. "Do you see it yet?" The voice was low, breathy, intimate in a way that made my skin crawl. It sounded like someone whispering secrets directly into my ear, like they were standing right behind me in the small cabin space. I grabbed the radio microphone, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Who is this? Identify yourself. This is an emergency frequency." No answer, just a slow, deliberate exhale that seemed to go on forever, then the line went dead with a finality that felt like a door slamming shut. Lightning lit up Widow's Grief Ridge again, turning the world into a stark photograph of black trees against white sky. And this time, there wasn't one figure in Devil's Clearing. There were three. Three tall, impossibly thin shapes standing in perfect formation, like soldiers at attention. Like they were waiting for orders. Like they were waiting for me. The next lightning strike was quick, barely enough to illuminate their outlines before the darkness swallowed them again, but I knew what I saw. I've replayed that image in my mind thousands of times since that night, and it never gets less terrifying. Three figures, all the same height, all the same impossible proportions, all facing directly toward Tower Number 6. Still as statues. Patient as death. The radio was completely dead now. Not static, not garbled transmissions, not even the background hiss of an open channel. Dead. I switched channels twice, hit the side of the unit with more force than was probably wise, but it was like the thing wasn't even plugged in anymore. Like something had reached into the electronics and simply turned off my connection to the outside world. I told myself to stay calm, to think rationally, to remember my training. There had to be an explanation. The storm was heavy enough to distort shapes and create illusions. Those figures could be trees that I hadn't noticed before, could be fence posts from some old property line, could be any number of innocent things that looked threatening in the confused light of the storm. But then the wind shifted direction, and with it came something that made rational explanations impossible. The smell hit me before the sound, metallic and damp and fundamentally wrong, like pennies left in a bucket of stagnant water, like blood mixed with rain and something else I couldn't identify, but that made my stomach turn and my primitive brain scream warnings. Then, faint but rising above the sound of wind and rain, came the unmistakable creak of the tower's lower access ladder. You ever hear metal under weight? It's not just the sound, it's something you feel in your bones, in your teeth, in the parts of your body that remember what it was like to be prey. The tower had been built to sway with the wind, to flex and bend rather than break, but this was different. This was the sound of something climbing, something with purpose and intention. One rung, slow and deliberate. Another rung, the metal protesting under weight that felt heavier than it should be. I stepped back from the window and grabbed my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness of the stairwell but stopping at the landing halfway down. Nothing visible there. Just shadows and the geometric patterns cast by the tower's framework. The third rung groaned under whatever was climbing toward me. That's when I remembered something one of the older rangers, Markson, had told me during my first week on the job. He'd been laughing over coffee in the break room, telling ghost stories the way all the veterans do to spook the rookies, sharing tales of strange sightings and unexplained incidents that were probably just embellished encounters with wildlife or confused hikers. But then his face had gotten serious, the laughter dying away as he looked directly into my eyes. "Tower 6, he'd said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. If you ever get assigned there, and you ever hear someone climbing the ladder when there's no one scheduled to be up there, when dispatch hasn't sent anyone out, you don't wait to see their face. You don't call out to ask who it is. You shut the hatch and you keep it shut until morning." I'd asked him why, but he'd just shaken his head and changed the subject. Now I understood why he hadn't wanted to explain. I slammed the security hatch shut and dropped the iron latch into place, the metal ringing with finality. The sound of climbing stopped immediately, as if whatever was on the ladder had been waiting for exactly that response. But the next creak I heard didn't come from below. It came from directly above me. The sound from the roof was faint at first, almost lost in the symphony of wind and rain, but once I heard it, my brain refused to let it go, the way a tongue keeps probing a sore tooth. It was like a slow dragging noise, as if something incredibly heavy was being pulled across the metal surface above my head. But not dragged randomly. This movement had purpose, pattern, like whatever was up there was searching for something specific. The roof of tower number 6 was flat corrugated metal with a maintenance hatch that had been welded shut decades ago, no railing, no safety equipment, no reason for anyone to be up there, especially not during a storm. The wind alone should have made it impossible for anything to maintain its footing on the rain-slicked surface. I aimed the flashlight beam at the ceiling, a useless gesture that only served to highlight the water stains and rust that decorated the metal panels. My pulse was spiking in my throat, making it hard to swallow, hard to think clearly. "Hello?" I called out, immediately regretting the decision to announce my presence. My voice came out too loud in the confined space, bouncing off the walls and making me sound afraid. Which I was. The dragging stopped instantly. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of rain and wind and my own ragged breathing. I began to hope that whatever had been up there had moved on, had lost interest, had decided to torment someone else. Then something tapped the roof directly above where I was standing. Just once. Deliberate. Purposeful. Not rain. Not hail. Not debris thrown by the wind. One deliberate knock, like someone announcing their presence. Like something saying hello. I'd been in this job long enough to know when something was off: hikers who seemed too interested in restricted areas, bears that had learned to associate humans with food, storms that could turn deadly without warning, even poachers who thought the remote locations made them invisible to law enforcement. This wasn't any of those familiar dangers. This was something else entirely. The wind picked up again, howling around the tower with renewed fury, and through it I swore I heard something that made my skin crawl. Not words exactly, but the cadence of speech. The rhythm of communication. Like the sound people make when they hum to themselves in another room, except this humming had an alien quality that suggested the vocal cords producing it weren't quite human. I reached for the radio again, knowing it was useless but needing to try anyway. Still dead. The display wasn't even lit up anymore. That's when all the lights in tower number 6 went out at once. Not just my flashlight, though that died too. The propane lantern that provided the cabin's main illumination guttered and went dark. Even the small LED indicators on the weather monitoring equipment went black. Everything electrical in the tower simply stopped working, as if something had reached into the building systems and flipped a master switch. The darkness in tower number 6 is absolute. Thick and oppressive in a way that makes you understand why humans invented fire, why we've spent millennia fighting against the dark. You literally cannot see your own hand in front of your face. The darkness feels alive, pressing against you from all sides. I was fumbling my way toward the emergency supply kit when I heard the maintenance hatch above me beginning to creak. Slowly. Deliberately. Opening. The hatch above me inched open with the kind of careful precision that suggested intelligence, planning, patience. No violent bang of wind-caught metal, no frantic scraping of claws on steel. Just the slow, intentional movement of something that knew exactly what it was doing. I didn't breathe. My body simply refused to perform that basic function while I listened to the impossible sound of something entering tower number 6 from above. In the absolute blackness, my hearing became supernaturally acute. I could distinguish between the sound of rain on metal and the sound of other things. Through the roaring chaos of the storm, I heard something so out of place, so fundamentally wrong, that my stomach clenched with primal fear. Fingernails. Long, sharp fingernails tapping along the edge of the opened hatch. 1, 2, 3, 4. The tapping was rhythmic, almost playful, like someone drumming their fingers while deciding what to do next. I lunged for the emergency kit, my hands shaking as I ripped it open and searched for the spare flashlight by touch alone. My fingers found batteries, first aid supplies, emergency flares, and finally the cold metal cylinder I was looking for. The beam snapped on, harsh and narrow, cutting through the darkness like a sword. The maintenance hatch was closed. Sealed tight, just as it had been when I first entered tower number 6 that evening. As if it had never been opened at all. I kept the light trained on it for a full 30 seconds, waiting for movement, my knuckles white around the flashlight handle. Nothing. No sound from above, no sign that anything had ever been there. Finally, I forced myself to move away from the center of the cabin and step back to the window, scanning Devil's Clearing with the flashlight beam even though I knew the light wouldn't carry that far through the storm. The 3 figures were gone. The clearing appeared empty, just dark trees swaying in the wind. I thought, stupidly, desperately, that maybe whatever this was had passed. Maybe the storm had blown through and taken the strangeness with it. Maybe I could wait until dawn and walk away from tower number 6 with nothing more than an unsettling story to tell over beers. Then my radio crackled to life. Not static this time. Not the fragmented voice of base station Charlie trying to reach me through atmospheric interference. A voice, whispering so close to the microphone it felt like the words were being spoken directly into my brain. "You're not supposed to be here." I slammed the radio's power switch to the off position. The voice continued speaking. "You hear them too, don't you? The ones who came before." My flashlight beam swung wildly as I tried to locate the source of the transmission, but the radio sat silent and dark on the equipment table. The voice wasn't coming from the radio at all. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere, filling the small cabin space with its horrible intimacy. "They've been waiting so long. So very long." I pressed my hands against my ears, but the voice followed me inside my own head. "Look behind you." The beam of my flashlight hit the far wall of the cabin, illuminating the bank of windows that faced east toward the valley. And there, pressed against the glass from outside, were three perfect silhouettes. Three tall, thin shadows with arms too long and heads tilted at impossible angles, etched in perfect detail against the storm-lashed glass. They weren't standing on the platform outside the windows. Tower number 6 was 40 feet off the ground. They were floating. Hovering in the air like smoke given form, like nightmares made manifest. And they were all looking directly at me. I stumbled backward, my flashlight beam whipping wildly across the cabin walls as I tried to keep all three windows in view simultaneously. The shadows didn't move, didn't flinch when the light hit them, but something in my primitive brain was screaming that they weren't just shapes. They were observers. Judges. Executioners waiting for the right moment to carry out their sentence. The storm outside was beginning to weaken, the thunder growing more distant, but the wind was still alive and hungry, whistling through every gap in the tower's framework. And then I realized with growing horror that what I was hearing wasn't the wind at all. It was breathing. Deep, rhythmic, deliberate breathing that seemed to come from everywhere at once. From under the floor, from inside the walls, from the air itself. I ran to the security hatch that sealed off the lower ladder and checked it twice, still locked tight, the iron latch secure. Whatever was making that sound wasn't coming from below tower number 6. It was coming from inside the structure itself, as if the building had developed lungs and was drawing breath with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. The breathing grew louder, more pronounced, accompanied now by a faint scratching sound like fingernails on old wood, like something small and determined trying to claw its way out of confinement. I spun in a circle, flashlight beam dancing across every surface, looking for the source, when the light flickered once, twice, and then died completely. Something moved in that instant of absolute darkness. I didn't see it so much as feel it pass in front of me, a displacement of air that was cold and heavy and wrong, like walking through a cloud of invisible ice. The presence was massive and ancient and patient, and it carried with it the smell of deep places and forgotten things. When I frantically shook the flashlight back to life, the cabin was empty of living things. Except for the footprints. Wet, bare, unmistakably human footprints that started at the east wall and walked deliberately across the floor to the exact center of the cabin, where they stopped. Not turned around. Not continued to another wall. Just stopped, as if whatever had made them had simply ceased to exist in the middle of the room. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the footprints were still wet. Still dripping. Still warm enough that I could see small wisps of steam rising from them in the cold air of the cabin. I knelt down and held my hand above one of the prints. The warmth was real. Whatever had made these tracks had been here seconds ago, had passed close enough to touch me, had stood in the center of my sanctuary and decided what to do with me. The breathing sound faded, replaced by something worse, silence. Complete, absolute silence that felt expectant, like the moment before a judge delivers a verdict. Even the storm outside seemed to pause, waiting for whatever was going to happen next. That's when I heard the first ring. By then, The storm had blown past Widow's Grief Ridge, leaving behind only the occasional creak of the tower settling back into its normal rhythms and the steady drip of rainwater from the roof. The air smelled clean and washed, the way it always does after a hard rain, but underneath that freshness was something else. Something that reminded me of old basements and forgotten graves. I told myself I'd make a run for it at first light. I just had to sit still, stay quiet, and not acknowledge whatever was sharing Tower Number 6 with me. Don't feed the trolls, my grandmother used to say about playground bullies. Don't give them the reaction they're looking for, and eventually they'll get bored and move on to easier targets. I was clinging to that hope when the phone rang. Not the radio, I'd given up on that piece of useless equipment hours ago. The phone. Tower Number 6 had an old rotary landline mounted on the east wall, a relic from the days when fire lookouts needed reliable communication that couldn't be disrupted by atmospheric conditions. But the line had been disconnected years ago when the Park Service switched to radio systems. The phone was just a museum piece now, a conversation starter for the few rangers who got assigned to the old towers. But it was ringing. The actual bell inside the housing was chiming with mechanical precision, the sound echoing off the metal walls like a funeral dirge. Ring, ring, ring. I stared at it for 7 rings before my training kicked in. Emergency protocol. If any communication device activated, you answered it. Period. It could be Base Station Charlie trying to reach me through a backup system I didn't know about. It could be another ranger in trouble. It could be my only link to the outside world. I picked up the heavy black handset, my hand trembling slightly. Tower 6, I said, trying to sound professional. No voice on the other end. Just a slow, steady knocking sound transmitted directly into my ear through the phone line. The same rhythm I'd been hearing all night. Knock, knock, knock. And then, finally, words spoken in a voice that was almost human but not quite, like someone doing a careful impression of speech. Look behind you. I didn't want to turn around. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to keep facing the phone, to maintain eye contact with this one familiar object in a world that had gone completely insane. But the compulsion was stronger than my fear, like invisible hands physically turning my head. I turned. There was only one figure now, but it was inside Tower Number 6 with me. Standing in the far corner where the shadows were deepest, perfectly motionless, watching me with what I can only describe as patient curiosity. As if I were a fascinating specimen in a jar, something to be studied and catalogued before being disposed of. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed to bend at joints that didn't exist on human anatomy. Its skin was pale to the point of luminescence, with a texture that reminded me of old paper or dried leaves. But it was the face that will haunt me until the day I die. It had features that were almost human but stretched and distorted like a photograph that had been pulled out of shape. Eyes that were too large and too dark, reflecting the light from my flashlight like pools of black water. A mouth that was too wide, filled with teeth that were too sharp and too numerous. And it was smiling. The same impossible smile I'd seen through the binoculars hours earlier, but now I could see it in perfect, horrible detail. It wasn't the smile of something happy or amused. It was the smile of something that had finally found what it had been looking for. The phone in my hand was still transmitting that rhythmic knocking, but now I could see where the sound was coming from. The thing in the corner was tapping one impossibly long finger against the wall in perfect time with the sound coming through the phone line. Knock, knock, knock. Found you, the voice whispered, and I realized it was speaking without moving its lips. The words were forming directly in my mind, bypassing my ears entirely. That's when my sanity finally snapped. I don't remember dropping the phone or grabbing my gear or fumbling with the security hatch. The next thing I knew, I was running down the access ladder in complete darkness, my feet finding the rungs by pure muscle memory and desperation. Behind me, I could hear laughter, not the warm sound of human amusement, but something cold and alien that seemed to come from multiple sources at once. The latter seemed to go on forever, stretching down into a darkness that felt deeper than the forest floor should have been. My hands were torn and bleeding from gripping the metal rungs too tightly, but I didn't care. All that mattered was getting away from Tower Number 6 and the thing that had been waiting for me there. When my feet finally hit solid ground, I ran. I don't remember how I got out of the forest that night. The next thing I knew, I was walking down the main access road in the gray light of dawn, soaking wet from the storm, without my gear, without my radio, without any clear memory of the journey from Widow's Grief Ridge to the valley floor. Tower Number 6 stood silent behind me in the distance, its windows dark and innocent looking in the morning light. Just another piece of park infrastructure doing its job, watching over the wilderness. Nothing to suggest the horror I'd experienced during those endless hours of darkness. But I could feel it watching me even as I walked away. I could feel those impossible eyes tracking my movement, recording my retreat, filing away the information for future use. When I stumbled into Base Station Charlie at 6:23 a.m., looking like I'd been through a war, Chief Ranger Morrison took one look at me and called for medical assistance. I was dehydrated, hypothermic, and according to the medic, showing signs of severe psychological trauma. What the hell happened out there? Morrison asked while the medic wrapped me in thermal blankets and forced hot coffee into my hands. I told him everything. Every detail, every moment of terror, every impossible thing I'd witnessed during my shift at Tower Number 6. I expected him to laugh, to dismiss it as hallucinations brought on by isolation and storm stress. I expected him to recommend psychiatric evaluation and mandatory leave. Instead, his face went pale, and he exchanged a look with Deputy Chief Sanders that told me they'd heard stories like this before. "Show me the assignment log," Morrison said quietly. Sanders pulled out the duty roster and spread it across the desk. They both stared at it for a long moment before Morrison looked up at me with something that might have been sympathy. "According to this," he said carefully, "Tower 6 has been locked and unused for over a year. Budget cuts. We moved all fire watch operations to the automated sensor network last spring." He showed me the keys, still hanging on their designated hook on the office wall, dusty and undisturbed. "The access road to Widow's Grief Ridge has been closed since last October," Sanders added. "Washout took out the bridge at Devil's Creek. There's no way to get vehicle access to Tower 6, and it's a 12-mile hike through rough terrain." I stared at them, trying to process what they were telling me. But I was assigned there. I have the paperwork. I have the radio codes. Morrison pulled my assignment file and opened it. The pages were blank. Not erased, not whited out. Blank, as if they'd never been written on. "According to our records," he said gently, "you were scheduled for a desk shift last night. Administrative work. You never left the office." But I had. I knew I had. My boots were muddy, my jacket soaked with rain that had fallen on Widow's Grief Ridge. My hands bore cuts from the ladder rungs, and I could still smell that metallic, wrong odor that had filled Tower Number 6 during the long hours of terror. "I need to see a doctor," I said finally. Morrison nodded. "We've already called Dr. Hendricks. She'll be here within the hour." But even as they made arrangements for my care, even as they filed their reports and began the process of placing me on administrative leave, I could see the doubt in their eyes. Not doubt about my story, doubt about what they were going to do about it. Because they believed me. They knew Tower Number 6 had a reputation, had a history that went back decades before my encounter. They knew other rangers had reported similar experiences, similar impossible encounters with things that shouldn't exist. They just didn't know how to help me. The psychiatric evaluation lasted 6 months. Dr. Hendricks was thorough and patient, working with me to reconstruct that night and separate reality from hallucination. She diagnosed me with acute stress disorder complicated by isolation psychosis, prescribed medication and therapy, and eventually cleared me to return to limited duty. But I never went back to Fire Watch. I requested transfer to the education department, where I could work with school groups and nature walks, where I'd never be alone in the wilderness after dark. Where I'd never have to climb another tower and listen to the wind tell me secrets I didn't want to hear. The nightmares faded after the first year. The hypervigilance and startle responses gradually lessened. I learned to sleep through the night again, learned to enjoy silence instead of fearing it. Dr. Hendricks said I was making excellent progress. I almost believed I was getting better. Until last night. The knocking started at 2:17 a.m., according to my bedside clock. The same rhythm, the same deliberate patience. Knock, knock, knock. But this time, it wasn't coming from tower number 6 on Widow's Grief Ridge. It was coming from inside my bedroom wall. I lay in bed, paralyzed with the memory of that night 3 years ago, as the sound moved slowly around the room. From the north wall to the east wall to the south wall, always staying at exactly the same height, as if something was walking around the outside of my house at the second-story level. But that's impossible. My bedroom is on the second floor, and there's nothing outside my windows except a straight drop to the concrete driveway below. The knocking continued for exactly 17 minutes. I watched the clock, counting each second, praying for it to stop. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, silence returned. But the smell lingered. That metallic, damp, wrong smell that I remembered from tower number 6. The smell of deep places and ancient patience and something that had been waiting far too long for the chance to finish what it started. I haven't slept since. This morning, I called Base Station Charlie and asked Morrison if he was still Chief Ranger. He is, though he's planning to retire next year. I asked him about tower number 6, about whether it was still locked and abandoned. There was a long pause before he answered. "Funny you should ask," he said. "We're reopening it next month. New budget allocation for expanded Fire Watch coverage." "Why?" I told him not to staff it. I told him to leave it locked, to demolish it if necessary, to do anything except put another human being alone in that place during the long dark hours when the boundaries between worlds grow thin. He listened politely, the way you listen to someone you care about but know is damaged. When I finished talking, he promised to take my concerns under advisement. But I know he won't listen. How can he? How can anyone who hasn't experienced the patient hunger that lives in tower number 6, the ancient intelligence that treats human consciousness like a fascinating toy to be played with and discarded? So I'm writing this down. All of it. Every detail I can remember from that night 3 years ago, and everything that's happening now. Because the thing that waited for me in tower number 6 isn't finished with me yet. It followed me home. And tonight, when the sun goes down and the darkness returns to claim the world, I know I'm going to hear that knocking again. Closer this time. More insistent. Because some things don't give up. Some things don't forget. Some things have all the patience in the world and understand that 3 years is nothing more than a heartbeat in the larger rhythm of time. The thing in tower number 6 is coming for me. And this time, there's nowhere left to run. Knock, knock, knock. It's starting again. You won't find Trail 47 on any of the park maps. Not the official ones distributed at the Whispering Pines National Forest Visitor Center, not the tourist trail guide sold at Ravens Hollow Lodge, not even the old ranger survey charts we keep locked away in the musty archives beneath Shadowmere Station. Those yellow documents, some dating back to the 1940s when this wilderness was first mapped, contain detailed topographical surveys of every ridge, valley, and creek bed in our territory. Every trail has been catalogued, measured, and marked with GPS coordinates that are accurate to within 3 feet. But Trail 47 isn't on any of them. I didn't believe the stories myself until last fall, when a hiker named Jenna Myers went missing during what should have been a routine day trek through the Morningwood section of the park. She was an experienced hiker, the kind who carried emergency beacons, checked weather reports religiously, and left detailed itineraries with 3 different people before setting foot on any trail. Her disappearance made no sense. We found her silver Honda Civic in the north parking area of Devil's Backbone Ridge, keys still dangling from the ignition, driver's seat pushed back like she'd been stretching before her hike. Her pack lay abandoned in the tall grass beside the trailhead, a high-end hiking backpack that had cost her nearly $400, scattered with energy bars and a half-empty water bottle that was still cold to the touch. Her footprints were clear in the soft earth beside Weeping Creek Trail, size 7 hiking boots with a distinctive chevron tread pattern. We followed them for nearly a mile along the familiar path that wound through the towering pines and ancient oaks. I'd walked that trail 100 times in my 15 years as a ranger, knew every fallen log and rocky outcrop by heart. But then the footprints veered off the main trail. They ended at a fork that shouldn't exist, couldn't exist. I'd been down this exact stretch of path just 2 weeks prior during routine maintenance, clearing fallen branches and checking trail markers. There had been no fork, no branching path, nothing but the continued loop that eventually circled back to the parking area. The left branch was the normal continuation of Weeping Creek Trail, marked with the familiar white blazes painted on tree trunks every 50 yards. The right branch was something else entirely, a narrow dirt path that seemed to emerge from between 2 massive pine trees, their trunks so close together I hadn't noticed the gap between them before. At the mouth of this impossible path stood a wooden post, weathered gray and splintered with age. Carved into its surface, crudely, like it had been scratched with a pocketknife by someone with shaking hands, was the number 47. 3 of us followed that trail, myself, Ranger Martinez from the South Station, and Deputy Chen from the County Sheriff's Office. We followed it for 2 miles through forest that grew progressively stranger with each step. The trees got denser, their branches intertwining overhead to block out more and more of the afternoon sun. The air felt heavier, almost thick enough to taste, with a metallic quality that reminded me of the moments before a thunderstorm. The path itself seemed wrong. It felt like we were hiking downhill even when my compass and the lay of the land clearly indicated we were moving across level ground. My boots, which had never given me problems in all my years of hiking, began to feel leaden, each step requiring more effort than it should have. And then, without warning or transition, the trail just stopped. No clearing, no marker, no indication that we'd reached any kind of destination. The compacted dirt simply faded into bare granite bedrock, smooth and gray like the surface of a tombstone. Beyond that was nothing but forest so thick and dark that you couldn't see more than 5 feet into it. The trees here were different, their trunks twisted into unnatural shapes, bark blackened as if by some ancient fire, roots bursting from the ground like gnarled fingers. We called for Jenna Myers until our voices went raw and the shadows began to lengthen. We shouted her name into that impenetrable wall of vegetation, our calls swallowed by the silence as if the forest itself was absorbing the sound. No answer came back. Not even an echo. 3 days later, just as the search and rescue teams were preparing to expand their grid into the next county, Jenna Myers walked into Shadowmere Ranger Station barefoot. Her expensive hiking boots were gone, her socks shredded to ribbons. Her clothes hung in tatters from her thin frame, torn as if she'd been crawling through brambles for hours. Her skin was pale gray, cold to the touch even though the afternoon sun was warm on our faces, and her eyes held a distant look that made me think of someone staring at something very far away. We wrapped her in emergency blankets and called the paramedics, but she refused to go to the hospital. She sat in our break room, sipping coffee with hands that trembled slightly, and answered our questions in a voice that sounded hollow, like it was coming from the bottom of a well. We asked where she'd been for 3 days. She looked at us with those distant eyes and said, "I was on the trail." We told her the trail didn't go anywhere, that we'd followed it to where it ended, found nothing but solid rock and impassable forest. And she said, in that same hollow voice, "I know. That's where it takes you." A month after Jenna Myers came back, Chief Ranger Morrison sent me to check Trail 47 again. The assignment came down through official channels, a work order marked Unofficial Path Hazard Inspection, filed in triplicate and stamped with the Forest Service seal. But I knew the real reason, had seen it in Morrison's weathered face when he handed me the paperwork. Rangers had been spotting the fork again. That was the thing about Trail 47, it wasn't always there. You could walk the same stretch of Weeping Creek Trail a dozen times, know every root and rock along the way, and never see the right-hand branch. The path would be exactly as it should be, nothing but the main loop winding through familiar forest. But sometimes, when the light hit a certain way or when you were alone on the trail with nothing but your own thoughts for company, you'd round that familiar bend and there it would be. The wooden post. The number 47 carved deep into weathered grain. The narrow path disappearing between the pine trees like it had always been there, like you'd simply failed to notice it before. 3 other rangers had reported seeing it in the past month. Jenkins from the East Station had spotted it during his morning patrol but hadn't investigated, claiming he'd been too busy with other duties. Sarah Walsh from maintenance said she'd seen it twice, once during the day when she'd convinced herself it was just a trick of the light and shadows, and once at dusk when she'd been too spooked to do anything but hurry past. Most concerning was veteran Ranger Tom Bradley's report. Bradley had 30 years of experience in these woods, knew them better than anyone except maybe Chief Morrison himself. He'd seen the trail 3 times in 2 weeks, and on the last occasion, he claimed to have heard something coming from the path, not voices exactly, but something like whispers carried on wind that shouldn't have existed in the still forest air. That morning, October 15th, the fog was heavy throughout Morning Wood, clinging to the tree line like ancient spiderwebs thick with moisture. The mist seemed almost alive, shifting and coiling between the trunks in patterns that looked almost purposeful. I'd started my patrol before dawn, my breath visible in the cold air as I made my way along the familiar network of trails. I reached the fork just before 10 a.m., my watch reading 9:47 when I rounded the bend where Weeping Creek Trail should have continued unbroken toward Sorrow Falls. But there it was, the wooden post emerging from the fog like a grave marker. The number 47 was carved deeper than I remembered, the cuts dark as if they'd been burned into the wood rather than cut. I stood there for several minutes, checking my GPS unit and consulting the trail map folded in my pocket. According to every official source, I was looking at empty forest. But the path stretched ahead of me, clearly defined, the earth packed down by the passage of feet. I pulled out my radio and reported my position to base. Shadowmere Station, this is Ranger Collins. I'm at the reported anomaly on Weeping Creek Trail. The unauthorized path is present and appears to be in active use. Beginning investigation. Morrison's voice crackled back through static. Copy that, Collins. Maintain radio contact. Do not proceed beyond the 2-mile mark established in previous reconnaissance. I clipped the radio back to my belt and stepped onto Trail 47. The change was immediate and unsettling. The forest swallowed the sound of my boots instantly, no crunch of leaves underfoot, no creak of leather, no rustle of fabric as I moved. Even my breathing seemed muffled, as if the air itself was somehow denser here. The familiar sounds of the forest, bird calls, the whisper of wind through branches, the distant murmur of Weeping Creek, all fell away until there was nothing but the faint hum in my ears that I'd learned to associate with high altitude, though my altimeter showed no significant elevation change. The path wound between trees that seemed older than the rest of the forest, their trunks massive and scarred with age. Spanish moss hung from their branches like funeral shrouds, moving slightly in breezes I couldn't feel on my skin. The undergrowth here was different too, plants I didn't recognize despite my botany training, with leaves that seemed too large and too dark, their surfaces shining with moisture that looked black in the filtered light. 2 miles in, I found the granite outcrop where the trail had ended during our search for Jenna Myers. Only now, impossibly, the trail kept going. The packed earth continued beyond the rock, winding deeper into forest that seemed to grow darker with each step despite the sun still being high overhead. The ground here was different, pale, almost white, like ash or ground bone. My boots left clear impressions in the strange soil, but there were no other footprints visible. No sign that anyone else had walked this way, despite the packed appearance of the path itself. The trees leaned inward as I progressed, their trunks twisted into shapes that hurt to look at directly. Their roots erupted from the pale ground in impossible configurations, creating natural archways and tunnels that the path wound through. Some of the roots were massive, thick as my torso, snaking across the trail in patterns that looked almost deliberate. That's when I saw the first backpack. It was hanging from a branch about 7 feet up, suspended by its shoulder straps and swaying slightly though there was no wind to move it. The pack was expensive, a military-grade hiking bag in forest green, the kind serious backcountry enthusiasts used for multi-day expeditions. Despite being exposed to the elements, it looked relatively new. I used a fallen branch to hook the straps and bring it down. Inside, I found a water bottle half full of clear liquid that had no taste when I cautiously touched a drop to my tongue. There was also a topographical map of an area I didn't recognize. The terrain features and elevation markings looked like they might belong to our forest, but the trail networks didn't match anything I'd seen in 15 years of service. But it was the photograph that made my blood run cold. It was a Polaroid picture, the kind people don't take much anymore, showing a man in his 30s with sandy brown hair and a beard. He was smiling at the camera, one hand raised in a friendly wave, standing in front of what looked like the wooden post marking Trail 47. But I'd never seen this man before, couldn't place him among any of the missing persons reports we'd filed over the years. On the back of the photograph, written in pencil that had smudged with moisture, were 4 words that made my hands shake: "Don't follow the lights." I slipped the photograph into my jacket pocket and continued deeper along Trail 47, my sense of unease growing with each step. The radio on my belt had gone silent, not static or interference, just complete dead air when I tried to raise Shadowmere Station. My GPS unit showed nothing but error messages, its screen flickering between different positions that placed me anywhere from 3 miles north to 5 miles south of where I knew I actually was. The trail narrowed as I progressed, the path becoming so constricted that I could touch both sides with my arms outstretched. The bark of the trees here was damp and soft under my fingers, almost spongy, with a texture that reminded me unpleasantly of waterlogged flesh. The air carried a smell that was wrong in ways I couldn't quite identify, not rot or decay exactly, but sweet and cloying, like fruit left too long in the sun, mixed with something metallic that made my mouth water in all the wrong ways. My watch showed 12:15 when the first light appeared. It was faint at first, a pale blue glow drifting between the trees about 30 feet ahead of me on the left side of the trail. Not bright like a lantern or flashlight, but soft and diffuse, pulsing with a rhythm that reminded me of a slow heartbeat. The light seemed to move with purpose, floating through the air about 6 feet off the ground, weaving between the twisted tree trunks with fluid grace. I remembered the note from the photograph: "Don't follow the lights." So I kept my eyes fixed on the trail ahead and continued walking, fighting the urge to look directly at the mysterious illumination. But peripheral vision is a treacherous thing, and I couldn't help but notice how the light seemed to pace me, maintaining its distance as I moved deeper into the forest. The thing about Trail 47, I was beginning to realize, is that it doesn't follow the normal rules. The packed earth under my boots gradually transitioned back to that ashy pale ground I'd encountered earlier, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly when the change occurred. It was as if the trail itself was shifting around me, rearranging itself while I walked. And suddenly, impossibly, the blue light was right beside the trail. It hovered at eye level, no more than 10 feet away, flickering faintly like a candle flame in a gentle breeze. Up close, I could see that it wasn't simply a ball of light, there were patterns within it, swirling movements that almost looked like they had structure, purpose. And underneath the constant hum that filled the air on Trail 47, I could almost hear something else. A whisper, stretched thin like it was coming from very far away, so faint I couldn't be sure I wasn't imagining it. But then it said my name. David, the whisper breathed, barely audible above the humming in my ears. David Collins. I froze in the middle of the trail, my heart hammering against my ribs. The light drifted backward, moving away from the path and deeper into the trees, and for just a moment I could swear I saw a shape inside the glow, human, maybe, but blurred and indistinct, like someone standing behind frosted glass. I forced myself to keep walking, my legs feeling like lead weights. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to run back the way I'd come, but I had a job to do. People had gone missing on this trail. Whatever was happening here, I needed to understand it. The second light appeared 20 minutes later, brighter than the first and shifting between the tree trunks ahead of me. This one pulsed more rapidly, its blue glow casting shifting shadows that seemed to dance among the twisted roots and hanging moss. The whisper was clearer this time, multiple voices overlapping in a harmony that raised goosebumps along my arms. "Come see," they said, the words carrying an invitation that felt both welcoming and deeply wrong. "Come see what we found." I pulled out my radio again, desperate for contact with the outside world. But when I switched it on, instead of static or the familiar hiss of dead air, there was a voice I didn't recognize, clear as if the speaker was standing right beside me. "You're close now," it said in a tone that might have been reassuring if not for the hollow quality that made it sound like it was echoing up from the bottom of a deep well. "Very close to where you need to be." I fumbled with the radio controls, switching between channels, but every frequency carried the same unknown voice, "Don't turn back now, David. We've been waiting." More lights began to appear among the trees, dozens of them, creating a constellation of blue glows that surrounded the trail on both sides. They moved in patterns that seemed almost like a dance, weaving between the trunks and floating through the air with hypnotic grace. Each one contained that same blurred human shape, faces just barely visible in the ethereal glow. And with each light came whispers, voices calling my name, inviting me forward, promising answers to questions I hadn't even thought to ask. The trail began to descend now, winding downward through terrain that my topographical training told me should be level ground. The pale, ashy soil gave way to something that looked almost like sand, fine-grained and white as bone dust. My boots left deep impressions that seemed to fill themselves in behind me, as if the ground was healing itself with each step. The lights pressed closer, their whispers becoming more insistent, more personal. They spoke of things they couldn't possibly know, my childhood fears, the dreams that woke me in the middle of the night, the secret doubts I'd never shared with another soul. They promised understanding, companionship, an end to the loneliness that came with spending too much time alone in the wilderness. "Just a few more steps," they urged. "Just a little further, and you'll understand everything." I gripped the photograph in my pocket like a talisman, the stranger's warning the only thing keeping me anchored to reality as the lights swirled around me and the voices grew louder, more compelling, until they seemed to be coming from inside my own head. The path finally opened into a clearing, but as soon as I stepped out from between the twisted trees, I realized that clearing wasn't the right word for what I was seeing. The ground wasn't earth or grass or even the pale, ashy soil that had marked the later portions of the trail. Instead, I found myself standing at the edge of a perfectly circular pool of water. The water was shallow, perhaps ankle-deep, and so still it looked like black glass, reflecting the pale gray sky overhead with mirror-like precision. But the reflection was wrong somehow, showing stars that weren't visible in the daylight sky above, constellations I didn't recognize arranged in patterns that hurt my eyes to look at directly. In the center of the pool stood a figure. Not Jenna Myers, though for a moment my heart had leaped with the hope that I might finally understand what had happened to her. Not anyone I knew from the missing persons reports that crossed my desk with depressing regularity. This was someone, something, else entirely. It was tall, perhaps 6.5 feet, and thin in a way that seemed unnatural, as if it had been stretched like taffy. It wore what looked like ranger greens, the familiar uniform of the Forest Service, but the fabric was faded and weathered as if it had been exposed to the elements for decades. The shirt hung loose on the figure's frame, and I could see that the patches and badges were rusted beyond recognition, green with corrosion. But it was the face that made my blood run cold. Or rather, the absence of a face, where features should have been. There was only smooth, pale skin, unbroken except for the subtle suggestion of eye sockets and a mouth that never quite resolved into actual features no matter how hard I stared. "You shouldn't have come," it said, though its mouth, if it had one, didn't move. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, resonating through the water and the air around me like the sound of wind through a cave. "This place isn't for the living." I took a step forward, and my boot splashed into the edge of the water. The liquid was ice-cold, so frigid it burned, and immediately my foot began to go numb inside my waterproof hiking boot. Ripples spread outward from where I stood, but instead of the normal concentric circles I expected, the disturbance created patterns, geometric shapes that pulsed and shifted across the surface like living things. The lights that had followed me along the trail now surrounded the pool, dozens of blue glows hovering at various heights above the water. Up close, the human shapes inside them were clearer, more defined. I could make out faces now, some I recognized from missing persons reports going back years, others completely unfamiliar but all sharing the same distant, hollow expression I'd seen in Jenna Myers' eyes. There was the hiker who disappeared 2 summers ago during a solo backpacking trip through Ravens Hollow. A family of 4 who'd vanished without a trace while camping at Sorrow Falls. Even Ranger Jim Patterson, who'd supposedly transferred to a station in Colorado but whose paperwork had always seemed a little too convenient, a little too clean. "Trail 47 doesn't lead back," the faceless figure said, and now I could see other shapes moving beneath the surface of the water, more figures, dozens of them, walking in slow circles along the bottom of the pool like they were trapped in some eternal patrol. "It only leads deeper." The lights began to descend, moving closer to the water's surface, and I realized with growing horror that they were trying to join their companions beneath the black mirror. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, no longer trying to lure me forward but simply stating facts with the inevitability of gravity. "Your shift starts now, Ranger Collins," they said in unison, voices overlapping in a harmony that made my teeth ache. "Your shift starts now, and it never ends." I tried to step backward, to retreat to the relative safety of the trail, but my boot was stuck fast in the mud at the bottom of the pool. The water had risen somehow, now reaching nearly to my knee, and I could feel the cold spreading up through my leg like frostbite in reverse. The faceless figure began to move toward me, walking across the surface of the water as if it were solid ground. With each step, more details became visible, the way its ranger badge hung at an angle that suggested the pin had rusted through, the dark stains on its uniform that might have been blood or might have been something worse. "Welcome to the permanent assignment," it said, and though it had no mouth I could swear I saw it smile. "Welcome to Trail 47. I woke up at the fork in Weeping Creek Trail, my head pounding and my mouth tasting like copper pennies. The wooden post was gone, vanished as if it had never existed, leaving only the familiar continuation of the main trail winding through normal, healthy forest. Sunlight filtered down through green leaves instead of the twisted, blackened branches I remembered, and somewhere in the distance I could hear the cheerful sound of Weeping Creek babbling over its rocky bed. My watch showed 3:47 p.m. on October 15th, the same day I'd started my investigation, though the position of the sun suggested it was much later than when I'd first encountered Trail 47. My radio crackled to life with Morrison's concerned voice. "Collins, report your status. You missed your scheduled check-in." I tried to respond, but my voice came out as a croak. My throat felt raw, as if I'd been screaming for hours. I'm at the reported location, Chief. The unauthorized trail is not present. Must have been a mistake. Copy that. Return to base for debriefing. The hike back to Shadowmere Station should have taken 45 minutes, but somehow I made it in 20, as if the forest itself was eager to speed my departure. My legs felt unsteady, and twice I had to stop and lean against trees to catch my breath. There was something wrong with my reflection in the creek when I stopped to splash water on my face. My eyes looked distant, hollow, like someone staring at something very far away. Chief Morrison was waiting for me in his office when I arrived, his weathered face creased with concern. Before I could give my report, he handed me something that made my knees go weak. It was a photograph. A Polaroid, just like the one I'd found in the backpack hanging from the tree. But this one showed me, standing in front of the wooden post marking Trail 47, one hand raised in a friendly wave, smiling at the camera with those same distant, hollow eyes I'd seen in the creek's reflection. On the back, written in pencil that looked suspiciously like my own handwriting, were 4 words, "Don't follow the lights." "Jenna Myers brought this to us an hour ago," Morrison said quietly. "She said you asked her to deliver it. Said you wanted us to know you were okay, that you'd found where the trail really goes." I stared at the photograph, my hands shaking. I had no memory of taking it, no recollection of seeing Jenna Myers or asking her to deliver anything. But there I was, captured on film in a place that officially didn't exist, looking like I belonged there. "Collins," Morrison said, his voice gentle but firm, "I need you to tell me exactly what happened out there." I opened my mouth to explain, to tell him about the lights and the whispers, about the faceless figure in Ranger greens and the pool that reflected impossible stars. But what came out instead, in a voice that sounded hollow and far away, were different words entirely. "I was on the trail, Chief. Trail 47. It's where I belong now." Morrison's face went pale. He reached for his radio, probably to call for medical assistance, but I was already moving toward the door. I had work to do, after all. A shift that had just started. A shift that would never end. As I walked out of Shadowmere Station and back toward the trailhead, I could hear Morrison shouting behind me, could hear him calling for backup, for search and rescue, for anyone who might be able to help. But his voice seemed to be coming from very far away, growing fainter with each step I took toward Morning Wood. I had a trail to patrol now. A permanent assignment on a path that didn't appear on any map, in a forest where the rules were different and time moved in circles like the figures walking endlessly beneath the black water. Trail 47 was waiting for me, and this time, I knew exactly where it led. The wooden post materialized between the pine trees as I approached, the number 47 carved deep into weathered wood like a brand burned into flesh. I took my place beside it, one hand raised in a friendly wave, waiting for the next hiker to come along and take my photograph. After all, someone needs to warn them about the lights. I've worked in Shadowmere National Preserve for 15 years, and I've seen winters that'll freeze your eyelashes solid in under a minute. The kind of cold that creeps into your bones and stays there for months, the kind that makes the ancient pines crack like rifle shots in the dead of night. But I've never seen Whispering Hollow Lake freeze in September. It happened last year, 3 weeks before the first real snow, on a day when the temperature was hovering just above 50. The morning air still held that crisp bite of early autumn, and the maples around the preserve were just beginning to blush with their first hints of red and gold. I remember because I'd been planning to take my boat out one last time before winter storage, maybe catch some of the late-season trout that like to school near the thermal vents on the lake's western edge. Instead, I found myself staring at something that defied every natural law I'd learned in my decade and a half of wilderness management. One morning, the entire surface of Whispering Hollow Lake was a sheet of black ice, smooth as polished obsidian, stretching from the weathered granite shores to the distant pine-crowned islands. Not the cloudy, bubble-filled ice you'd expect from a sudden freeze, but something so clear and dark it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The surface was mirror-perfect, without a single crack or imperfection, as if some tremendous force had smoothed it with impossible precision. The tourists thought it was beautiful. They gathered along Sorrow's Edge Trail with their cameras and smartphones, marveling at nature's unexpected artistry. Children pressed their faces against the visitor center windows, breath fogging the glass as they pointed excitedly at the transformed landscape. We thought it was wrong. Dead wrong. The fish should have been floating belly up, a freeze that sudden and complete usually kills everything in the water. The thermal shock alone should have devastated the lake's ecosystem. Trout, bass, the ancient lake sturgeon that had called these depths home for over a century, they should all have been casualties of this impossible meteorological event. But when I walked out to inspect the surface, my boots crunching softly on the frost-rimmed shoreline, I saw them under the ice. Swimming. Not the erratic, desperate movements of creatures in distress, but something far more unsettling. Slow, deliberate, their movements too synchronized to be natural. Schools of fish moved in perfect formation, as if choreographed by some unseen conductor. They swam in spirals and figure eights, their movements creating hypnotic patterns beneath the crystal-clear surface. The trout, normally solitary hunters, moved in tight schools with the bass. Predator and prey swimming side by side, their usual territorial boundaries seemingly dissolved. Even stranger, they all moved in the same direction, a slow, clockwise circulation that encompassed the entire lake. Round and round they went, never stopping, never breaking formation. I stood there for nearly an hour, mesmerized and deeply disturbed by the sight. The sun climbed higher, but the ice showed no signs of softening. If anything, it seemed to grow thicker, more impenetrable, as the day wore on. That evening, I filed my report with a growing sense of unease. The words felt inadequate on paper. How do you document something that shouldn't exist? How do you explain that a lake has frozen solid in weather that should barely support morning frost? The first missing person was a kid named Evan, 9 years old, visiting with his family from the city. Bright-eyed and curious, the kind of child who collected interesting rocks and asked endless questions about everything he saw. His parents, exhausted from the drive up to Shadowmere, had been taking photos by the lake's edge when they noticed him wandering toward the water. They said he'd been throwing rocks at the ice, trying to break it. Small stones at first, then larger ones he'd gathered from the shore. Each rock would hit the surface with a sharp crack that echoed across the water, but the ice remained unmarked, unbroken. The stones would slide across the surface for a few yards before coming to rest, looking strangely small and insignificant against the vast expanse of black ice. When his parents looked away for just a moment, his father checking his phone for cell service, his mother searching through her bag for the thermos of hot chocolate they'd brought, Evan vanished. We found the rocks he'd been throwing, scattered in a rough line leading from the shore toward the lake center. We found his bright red winter coat, the one with the reflective patches that made him easy to spot in the wilderness. It was neatly folded on a flat boulder, as if he'd taken it off and carefully set it aside. We didn't find him. The search began immediately. Rangers, volunteers, and a helicopter from the county sheriff's office combed every inch of the preserve. We dragged the lake, or tried to. The ice was so thick and so perfectly smooth that our equipment couldn't penetrate it. Metal-tipped poles that should have punched through with ease simply skated across the surface, leaving no mark. 2 days later, a man named Howard Grimsley was ice fishing despite the posted warnings. A local, someone who'd been coming to Whispering Hollow Lake for 30 years. He knew these waters better than most, knew where the fish liked to congregate, knew the safest spots to drill holes. But that morning, he'd set up his portable shelter right over the deepest part of the lake, where the bottom dropped away into the thermal vents that fed up from some underground spring system. His truck was found parked in the usual spot, ice fishing gear scattered around his abandoned campsite. The hole he'd been trying to drill was barely a scratch in the surface, as if he'd been trying to bore through granite instead of ice. His thermos was still warm when we found it 8 hours later. Howard never came home. That night, I dreamed I was standing on the lake at midnight. In my dream, I wore nothing but my ranger uniform, but I felt no cold. The moon hung full and brilliant overhead, casting everything in stark silver light. The ice beneath my boots was not black as it appeared during the day, but crystal clear, like walking on a sheet of flawless glass suspended over an abyss. And under my boots, they were all there. Not just the fish, still swimming in their endless, hypnotic circles. Evan, still in his jeans and sneakers, his young face pale but peaceful. Howard, clutching his fishing rod, his eyes wide and staring. But there were others I didn't recognize, faces from different eras, different decades. A woman in a dress that looked like it belonged to the 1950s. A man in a military uniform that might have been from World War II. Children and adults, all suspended in the dark water beneath the ice, all looking up at me with the same expression of patient waiting. They were looking up at me from under the ice, mouths moving in perfect unison, as if they were trying to tell me something crucial, something I desperately needed to understand. But no sound reached my ears, only the sight of their synchronized speech, their pale lips forming words I couldn't hear. I woke up gasping, my heart hammering against my ribs, but the sound followed me into the waking world, a faint tapping on my bedroom window. Rhythmic. Persistent. Like fingernails against glass. When I stumbled out of bed and looked outside, there was nothing but frost coating the window. But the frost wasn't random, it had formed in the unmistakable shape of a handprint. Small. Child-sized. The print of a 9-year-old boy. The chief said it was just for public safety, his weathered face carefully neutral as he handed me the assignment sheet. But we both knew it was because no one else wanted to be out there after dark. The other rangers had started finding excuses, equipment maintenance, paperwork, sudden illnesses that always seemed to strike just as the sun was setting. Whispering Hollow Lake doesn't have a light source. No street lamps along the winding trails, no cabins with warm windows glowing through the trees, no dock lights reflecting off the water. The nearest town, Millhaven, is 15 miles away through winding mountain roads, and on a moonless night, the darkness around the lake is so thick it feels like a physical thing pressing against your eyes, seeping into your lungs with every breath. That night, thick clouds had rolled in from the north, blotting out even the stars. My flashlight beam seemed pitifully small against the overwhelming darkness, creating a narrow cone of visibility that only made the shadows beyond seem deeper and more threatening. The familiar trails that I could navigate blindfolded during daylight became alien pathways through a landscape that felt suddenly hostile. The ice was darker than the sky, a black mirror stretching into nothingness, swallowing my flashlight beam like it was falling into a bottomless well. When I played the light across the surface, it didn't reflect back the way ice should. Instead, the beam seemed to penetrate a few feet and then simply vanish, absorbed by whatever lay beneath. I followed the perimeter trail slowly, my boots crunching on the frost-stiffened grass, my breath forming pale clouds that dissipated quickly in the cold air. The familiar sounds of the forest, the rustle of small animals, the distant hoot of owls, the whisper of wind through the pines, were conspicuously absent. Even the ever-present hum of insects was gone, leaving only the sound of my own breathing and footsteps. Halfway along the eastern shore, near the old stone bridge that crossed Sorrow Creek where it fed into the lake, I heard it, tap tap tap. Slow. Even. Deliberate. Coming from out on the lake, maybe 50 yards from shore. I stopped walking and held my breath, straining to hear. The sound continued, not random like branches knocking together in the wind, but rhythmic. Purposeful. Like someone tapping a message in code. I thought it was wind playing tricks, some natural phenomenon I'd never encountered in all my years in the wilderness. Then I aimed my flashlight toward the source of the sound and saw the first hand. Pale, pressed flat against the underside of the ice, fingers splayed wide like a starfish. The nails were blue-black, the skin so translucent I could see the darker lines of veins beneath. But it wasn't the color or condition of the hand that made my breath catch in my throat, it was the way it moved. Not like it was waving, not like it belonged to someone drowning or struggling. The hand moved like it was searching for something, the fingers walking across the underside of the ice with deliberate precision, as if tracing invisible patterns or feeling for some specific texture or landmark. Another hand appeared beside it, then another. Soon, a dozen pale hands were pressed against the ice, all moving in that same searching pattern. Some were clearly adult hands, broad and weathered. Others were smaller, more delicate. One was tiny enough to belong to a child. The flashlight flickered, the beam wavering like a candle in the wind. When the light steadied, the hands were gone. The surface of the ice was empty, reflecting nothing but my own beam back at me. But the tapping sound continued, moving slowly across the lake, always just at the edge of my hearing. I turned to leave, every instinct screaming at me to get away from the water, to seek the relative safety of the ranger station and its electric lights and solid walls. That's when I saw the footprints. They led from the shoreline out onto the ice, bare feet, each step having melted a shallow crater into the surface before the water froze solid again around the impression. The prints were perfectly preserved, like fossils in stone, and they led in a straight line toward the center of the lake. I followed them without thinking, my rational mind overruled by a compulsion I couldn't name or resist. My boots slipped slightly on the slick surface, but the ice held firm beneath my weight. Each step produced a hollow sound, as if I was walking on the roof of some vast underground chamber. The world went utterly silent except for my breathing, which sounded harsh and amplified in the still air. The footprints continued ahead of me, growing slightly deeper as they progressed, as if whoever had made them was sinking more deeply into the surface with each step. The prints stopped 20 feet from shore, ending abruptly as if the person making them had simply vanished mid-stride. I knelt beside the final impression, playing my flashlight over the perfect outline of toes and heel, still clearly visible in the ice. Beneath the surface, something moved. Not fish this time. Not the pale, searching hands. Something bigger, something that displaced enough water to create ripples against the underside of the ice. The movement wasn't random. It was circling me. The shape under the ice moved with purpose, traveling in slow, deliberate passes just deep enough that my flashlight beam could barely trace its outline. It was massive, larger than any fish that should exist in these waters, larger than the old lake sturgeon that local legends claimed grew to impossible sizes in the deepest parts of Whispering Hollow. Every few seconds, as the shape completed another circuit around my position, it would ripple the water above it, and I'd catch glimpses of what lay beneath. Not skin or scales, but faces. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, pressed together in a shifting mosaic of human features. Some I recognized from missing persons reports, not just Evan and Howard, but others from years past. Sarah Chen, who'd vanished during a solo kayaking trip 3 summers ago. Marcus Webb, the photographer who'd come to document the lake's autumn colors and never returned to his hotel. Children and adults, locals and tourists, all of them pale and perfectly preserved beneath the ice. But there were others, faces I didn't recognize but somehow looked familiar, as if they belonged to people from old photographs or historical records. Their features had a timeless quality, as if they'd been suspended in the dark water for decades, waiting with infinite patience for something to happen. All of them stared up with the same wide, glassy eyes. Not the clouded eyes of the dead, but clear, aware, watching. And as the massive shape beneath them moved in its endless circle, their faces would shift and slide over each other like pieces of a puzzle rearranging themselves, creating new configurations while maintaining that constant, unblinking stare. The tapping began again, but now it was directly below me. I crouched carefully on the slick surface, pressing my ear to the ice despite every survival instinct screaming at me not to make contact with the frozen surface. It wasn't just tapping, it was knocking. A rhythm so precise it had to be deliberate communication. 4 slow knocks, a pause, then 3 fast knocks. Over and over, like a Morse code message being repeated endlessly. The sound was coming from multiple sources beneath the ice, creating an eerie harmony as dozens of hands knocked in perfect synchronization. The vibrations traveled up through the ice and into my bones, a low frequency that I felt as much as heard. My radio crackled to life, the sudden sound making me jump and nearly lose my balance on the slick surface. I expected static, the usual interference that plagued our equipment in the remote areas of the preserve. Instead, a voice whispered through the speaker, "Don't answer." The voice was soft, barely audible, but unmistakably clear. It sounded young, male, urgent. It sounded like Evan. I dropped the radio in shock, and it slid several feet across the ice before coming to rest against a thin fracture that I hadn't noticed before. The crack was no wider than a hair, but it was spreading outward from where the radio had stopped, spiderwebbing toward my boots with audible pops and snaps. The massive shape below moved faster now, no longer circling but darting back and forth in tight patterns. Every pass made the ice groan under my feet, and I could feel it flexing slightly, as if something enormous was testing its strength from below. The faces beneath the surface were more agitated now, their mouths opening and closing rapidly, though still in perfect unison. Their eyes tracked my movements, dozens of gazes following me as I carefully stepped away from the spreading crack. That's when something grabbed my ankle. The shock of contact made me slip, my palm slamming against the frozen surface as I tried to break my fall. Through the crystal-clear ice, I could see a pale arm wrapped around my leg from below, fingers digging hard enough to bruise even through my thick pants and boots. The skin was wrong, not just pale, but slightly translucent, with a texture that looked almost gelatinous. It was colder than the air, so cold it seemed to burn where it made contact. The grip was impossibly strong, like being held by a statue carved from ice. I kicked hard, panic overriding rational thought, and the grip loosened just enough for me to stagger back toward shore. But as I retreated, more arms emerged from beneath the ice, not breaking through but clearly visible beneath the surface. Hundreds of them, all reaching upward with that same desperate, searching motion. The knocking sound intensified, becoming a thunderous drumbeat that seemed to come from every direction at once. The ice cracked under my feet with each step, but held firm even as the fracture line spread like a spider web across the surface. Behind me, the water under the ice was churning now, not in waves but in long, dragging pulls, as if the whole lake was breathing. The massive shape had stopped moving in circles and was now directly beneath where I'd been standing, pressing upward against the ice with enough force to make the surface bulge slightly. I made it to shore, panting and shaking, my ankle throbbing where those impossible fingers had gripped it. Even through my thick winter clothing, I could see the marks they'd left, 5 distinct bruises in the perfect shape of human fingers, but larger than any hand should be. I should have gone straight back to base, should have called for backup, should have followed every protocol in the emergency handbook. Instead, I found myself circling toward the north side of the lake, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't explain or resist. The north shore was where the deepest part of the lake lay, where the bottom dropped away into trenches that our sonar equipment had never been able to fully map. Local Native American legends spoke of underwater caves in this area, passages that led to underground rivers and caverns that stretched for miles beneath the mountains. The moon broke through the clouds for just a moment, casting everything in stark silver light, and I saw something I'll never forget. At the very center of Whispering Hollow Lake, the ice was bulging upward. Not breaking or cracking, bending, like something enormous was pushing from below with tremendous, sustained pressure. The bulge was perfectly circular, maybe 20 feet across, rising from the surface like a massive bubble frozen in time. As I watched, transfixed, the bulge grew larger, pushing higher. The ice groaned under the strain, but it didn't break. Instead, it stretched like some impossible elastic material, maintaining its integrity even as whatever lay beneath it continued to push upward. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The surface smoothed again, returning to its perfectly flat state as if nothing had happened. The ice was flawless once more, without even a stress mark to indicate the tremendous forces that had just been at work beneath it. I blinked hard, wondering if I'd imagined the entire thing. But the afterimage was burned into my retinas, that perfect circle of displaced ice, rising like the back of some sleeping leviathan. I turned to leave, my nerves finally reaching their breaking point, and nearly tripped over a body. Face down on the shore, frost-crusted hair glittering in the moonlight, wearing a jacket I recognized from a missing persons bulletin that had crossed my desk 2 months ago. Jenny Martinez, age 34, reported missing after failing to return from a solo hiking trip. Her car had been found in the Whispering Hollow parking area, but despite extensive searches, no trace of her had ever been discovered. But when I rolled her over, expecting to find a corpse preserved by the cold, her skin was warm, warmer than mine, as if she'd been sitting by a fire instead of lying unconscious on the frozen ground. Her eyes snapped open, pupils blown wide, completely black in the moonlight. She looked directly at me, but her gaze seemed to look through me, as if she was seeing something else entirely. When she spoke, her voice was perfectly clear, unmarked by confusion or distress. "It's not frozen underneath," she whispered, her breath forming no cloud in the cold air. Before I could react, before I could ask her where she'd been or how she'd survived, she bolted toward the lake with inhuman speed. Her movements were too fluid, too coordinated for someone who'd been lying unconscious moments before. She stepped onto the ice without hesitation, without the careful testing steps anyone would take on an uncertain surface. With each step she took, she sank a little deeper, but not through the ice, into it, as if the solid surface was becoming liquid around her feet. The ice accepted her, flowing around her legs like thick honey, closing seamlessly behind her as she walked toward the center of the lake. Within moments, she was knee-deep, then waist-deep, then chest-deep, sinking steadily downward while continuing to walk. She never looked back, never showed any sign of distress or panic. She simply walked forward, sinking gradually into the ice as if it was the most natural thing in the world. When she finally disappeared completely, the surface closing over her head, the ice was flawless again. Not a ripple, not a crack, not even a bubble to mark where she'd entered the frozen surface. I stood there for long minutes, staring at the spot where she'd vanished, trying to process what I'd witnessed. The rational part of my mind insisted that what I'd seen was impossible, that cold and stress and lack of sleep were causing hallucinations. But the warmth of her skin lingered on my hands where I'd touched her. The memory of her voice, so clear and certain, echoed in my ears. And somewhere beneath the ice, I could still hear that rhythmic knocking, fainter now but persistent, like a heartbeat that never stopped. The moon disappeared behind the clouds again, plunging the lake back into absolute darkness. But I no longer needed light to know what was down there, waiting in the depths of Whispering Hollow Lake. Back at the ranger station, my hands shaking as I poured coffee that had gone cold hours ago, I pulled the old incident logs for the lake. The filing cabinets in the basement held records going back over a century, manila folders yellowed with age, filled with reports typed on ancient typewriters and written in the careful script of long-dead rangers. The earliest entry was from 1911, written in cramped, shaky handwriting that suggested the author's hand had been trembling as he wrote. "The lake freezes when it's hungry." The entry was signed by Ranger William Ashford, who according to the personnel files had worked at Shadowmere for only 6 months before disappearing during a routine patrol. His body was never found. I flipped through more pages, finding similar reports scattered across the decades. 1923, ice appears in summer months. Missing persons cluster around these events. 1937, the faces under the surface are not dead. They are waiting. 1954, it takes them when the numbers grow too thin. The lake must feed. Each report was signed by a different ranger, and each ranger, I discovered after checking the personnel files, had vanished within a year of making their entry in the log. The most recent entry before mine was dated just 15 years ago, in handwriting I recognized as belonging to my predecessor, Ranger Patricia Mills. The cycle repeats every 15 to 20 years. The ice comes early, the disappearances follow, and then winter arrives to cover the evidence. By spring, the lake returns to normal and everyone forgets. But it remembers. It's always remembering, always counting, always waiting for the numbers to grow again. Patricia's entry ended with a single line that made my blood run cold. I've seen my replacement arrive. The cycle begins again. I shut the book and looked out the window of the station, my reflection staring back at me from the dark glass. The moon had emerged from the clouds, bright and full, casting its silver light across the landscape. The ice was black as ever, a perfect mirror stretching across Whispering Hollow Lake. And from here, even at this distance, I could see them. The handprints pressed against the underside of the ice, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Pale marks scattered across the surface like stars reflected in still water. But these weren't reflections. These were the hands of everyone who had been taken, everyone who now waited beneath the frozen surface of Whispering Hollow Lake. Waiting for the cycle to complete itself. Waiting for the lake to grow hungry again. Waiting for me. As I watched, one of the handprints moved slightly, fingers curling in what might have been a wave. Or a beckoning gesture. In the distance, carried on the cold wind that rattled the station's windows, I could hear the knocking begin again. 4 slow knocks, pause, 3 fast knocks. The rhythm that had been repeating itself for over a century, the code that spelled out a message I was finally beginning to understand. The lake was calling. And sooner or later, I knew I would answer. I picked up my pen and opened the log to a fresh page, my hand already beginning to tremble as I prepared to write the next entry in a record that stretched back over 100 years. Outside, the knocking continued, patient and persistent, while the faces beneath the ice waited with the eternal patience of the truly hungry. The cycle was beginning again, just as it always had, just as it always would. And I was no longer just an observer documenting strange events. I was the next course in a feast that had been going on for longer than anyone could remember. The pen touched paper, and I began to write. Cabin 6 wasn't on any of the official maps of Whispering Pines National Forest. But if you hiked deep enough into the northern ridge, past the weathered, restricted area, signs that hung like broken teeth from rusted posts, you could find it. The trail wound through dense thickets of black spruce and ancient hemlocks, their branches so intertwined they formed a canopy that blocked out most of the sky. Even in daylight, this part of the forest remained shrouded in perpetual twilight. The cabin itself was a single-story log structure that seemed to crouch in its clearing like a predator waiting to strike. Its roof sagged under decades of accumulated snow and neglect, and the windows were so caked with grime and spider webs that you couldn't see inside. The logs had darkened to an almost black hue, as if the wood had been stained by something far worse than weather and time. We park rangers were told to keep tourists away from it. No reason given. No explanation offered. Just a stern directive delivered by our supervisor, Chief Ranger Mackenzie, whose weathered face would turn stone-cold whenever Cabin 6 was mentioned. "That place is off-limits," he'd say, his voice carrying a finality that discouraged further questions. "Keep everyone away. No exceptions." That rule held for decades, passed down from one generation of rangers to the next like a cursed inheritance. The older rangers would sometimes speak of it in hushed tones around the station's wood-burning stove, their voices dropping to whispers when they thought the newer recruits weren't listening. They spoke of strange lights glimpsed through the trees at night, of sounds that didn't belong to any known wildlife, of compasses that spun wildly when you got too close to that particular clearing. But the official stance was always the same: Cabin 6 didn't exist. Until last winter, when a blizzard roared down from the mountains with unprecedented fury, stranding 3 experienced hikers in the backcountry. With temperatures plummeting to -30 and visibility reduced to mere feet, they had broken into Cabin 6 for shelter. They had no choice, it was either that or freeze to death in the howling wind. Only one of them came out. His name was Miller, Thomas Miller, according to his driver's license. He staggered into our ranger station the next morning just as the sun was cresting the eastern peaks, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and pink that should have been beautiful but somehow seemed ominous that day. Miller was barefoot, his feet so frostbitten they were black at the toes. His lips were cracked and bleeding from the cold, and his eyes held a wild, haunted look that I'd never seen before and hoped never to see again. He kept repeating the same thing over and over, his voice a hoarse whisper that seemed to echo strangely in the warm confines of our station: "Don't look at the walls. Don't look at the walls. Don't look at the walls." When we pressed him for details about his companions, Sarah Chen and Marcus Rodriguez, both seasoned hikers in their 30s, Miller froze completely. His body went rigid as if every muscle had suddenly locked into place. His pupils dilated until they swallowed almost all the color in his eyes, leaving them black as the windows of Cabin 6 itself. "They're part of it now," he whispered, and something in his tone made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "They're part of the wood." The rescue team reached the cabin that afternoon, struggling through drifts that came up to their waists. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline silence that seemed to press against their eardrums. They found 2 backpacks sitting neatly by the cold fire pit, 3 sets of boots arranged in a perfect line by the door, and the remnants of what looked like a hastily abandoned meal. But there were no footprints leading away from the place, not even Miller's, despite his claims of having walked all night through the snow to reach our station. Inside, the walls had been stripped bare of any paneling or insulation that might have once covered them. There was just rough timber, the logs fitted together with the kind of craftsmanship that spoke of another era, when men built things to last forever whether they should or not. Except the wood was carved from floor to ceiling with faces. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. They covered every available surface like a grotesque wallpaper of human expressions frozen in wood. Some were serene, almost peaceful. Others were twisted in expressions of absolute terror, their mouths stretched wide in silent screams. The carving work was incredibly detailed, you could see individual eyelashes, the texture of lips, the fine lines around eyes that spoke of lives lived and lost. And 2 of them were perfect likenesses of the missing hikers. Sarah Chen's face was carved near the eastern wall, her expression one of dawning horror, as if she'd just realized what was happening to her. Marcus Rodriguez was on the opposite wall, his features captured in a moment of desperate pleading, his mouth open as if he were calling for help that would never come. The rescue team photographed everything, but the images came out strangely blurred, as if the camera had been unable to properly focus on the carved faces. When they tried to take samples of the wood for analysis, their tools broke, first the chisel, then the saw, then even the simple knife one of them had brought. It was as if the cabin itself was resisting any attempt at scientific scrutiny. That night, I was assigned to guard the trail leading to Saromir Clearing, the official name we'd given to the area around Cabin 6, though none of us ever used it in casual conversation. The snow was falling again in thick sheets, muting the world until everything beyond 10 feet became a gray void. My flashlight beam barely penetrated the swirling flakes, creating a small bubble of visibility that seemed to press in on me from all sides. But I swear, every time I turned my head, I caught sight of something in the trees. Not a figure or an animal or anything that belonged in these woods. It was a face, carved into the bark of the towering pines that surrounded the trail. And they were new, the wood still raw and bleeding sap, as if they'd been carved just moments before my arrival. As the night wore on, there were more of them. They appeared between one glance and the next, materializing on tree trunks that had been blank just seconds before. Men, women, children, all with that same expression of dawning horror that I'd seen on Sarah Chen's carved features back in the cabin. By dawn, every tree within sight of my position bore at least one face. And the newest one looked exactly like Thomas Miller. The order came down at 6 o'clock sharp on a Tuesday morning that dawned gray and bitter cold. I was to perform a structural integrity check on cabin 6 before the next storm front rolled in from the northwest. The weather service was predicting another blizzard within 48 hours, and officially, we needed to ensure that the structure wouldn't pose a hazard to any potential emergency shelters who might stumble upon it. That's Ranger speak for, go in, make sure nothing collapsed during the winter, document anything unusual, and get the hell out as quickly as possible. But everyone knew the truth. Nobody volunteered for Cabin 6 duty. The assignment rotated through the ranger staff like a plague, and whoever drew the short straw accepted it with the grim resignation of a condemned man. I'd been with the Forest Service for 8 years, and I'd managed to avoid it until now through a combination of luck and strategic vacation scheduling. But my luck had finally run out. Chief Mackenzie delivered the assignment personally, something he rarely did for routine inspections. He stood in my cubicle at the back of the station, his weathered hands clasped behind his back, his pale blue eyes avoiding direct contact with mine. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed and flickered, casting strange shadows across his deeply lined face. "It's just a formality, Davidson," he said, but his voice carried none of its usual conviction. "Standard procedure before severe weather. Take your time, be thorough, but don't linger. Document what you find and come straight back. Radio check every 30 minutes, no exceptions." I nodded, though we both knew that radios had a tendency to malfunction in the vicinity of Saromir Clearing. The last 3 rangers assigned to Cabin 6 duty had all reported complete communication failures once they got within a quarter-mile of the structure. Technical services had replaced equipment, upgraded antennas, even brought in specialists from the regional office. Nothing helped. I loaded my pack with what I hoped were the essentials: heavy-duty flashlight with extra batteries, backup handheld spotlight, emergency flare gun, first aid kit, GPS unit, backup compass, emergency blanket, and enough food and water for 2 days, though I planned to be back long before nightfall. I debated bringing my service weapon, a .40 caliber Glock that I'd qualified with but never drawn in the line of duty, but if the stories were true, if even half the whispered tales shared around the station's break room had any basis in reality, bullets wouldn't matter. Instead, I clipped a can of bear spray to my belt and shouldered the pack. The trail to Saromir Clearing began innocuously enough, following a well-maintained path that wound through stands of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir. But as I climbed higher into the northern reaches of the forest, the maintained trail gave way to something older, less official. The blazes on the trees were faded and irregularly spaced, carved with symbols that didn't match any of the standard forestry markings I'd been trained to recognize. The hike-in was unnaturally silent. The snow, which had been falling lightly when I left the station, dampened every sound until even my own boots seemed muffled against the trail. No bird calls echoed through the trees. No squirrels chattered from the branches overhead. Even the wind, which should have been sighing through the pine boughs, seemed to die away to nothing as I climbed higher. The silence was so complete that I found myself stopping periodically just to listen, straining to hear something, anything, that would indicate normal forest activity. But there was nothing. It was as if the very ecosystem had learned to avoid this place, leaving it abandoned to whatever dwelt in its shadows. Halfway to the clearing, my radio crackled with static. I pulled it from my belt and tried to check in with base, but the static only grew worse. Then, buried beneath the electronic noise, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was a voice, faint but unmistakably human, whispering my name with an intimacy that suggested the speaker knew me well. Davidson. Davidson, come home, Davidson. I switched off the radio immediately, my hands shaking as I clipped it back to my belt. The voice hadn't come from the base station. I knew every ranger on duty, and none of them sounded like that. The voice had been soft, almost seductive, with an undertone that reminded me of wind sighing through dead leaves. The last quarter-mile to Saromir Clearing felt like the longest hike of my life. The trail seemed to stretch and distort, each step taking me farther from safety while somehow never bringing me any closer to my destination. The trees pressed in on both sides, their branches interlocking overhead to form a tunnel of perpetual twilight. When I finally emerged into the clearing, Cabin 6 was smaller than I remembered from the photographs I'd studied back at the station. It seemed to squat low against the earth, as if the weight of its own malevolence was slowly pressing it down into the soil. The roof sagged more severely than the photos had indicated, and several of the window frames hung at odd angles, giving the structure the appearance of a face caught mid-scream. The door hung crooked on hinges so rusted they looked like they might crumble at a touch. But what struck me most forcefully was the utter absence of any sign that people had sheltered here recently. There were no footprints in the snow around the cabin, no indication that a rescue team had tramped through the area just weeks before. It was as if the forest had already begun the process of erasing any evidence of human intrusion. I approached slowly, my flashlight beam sweeping back and forth across the structure's facade. The logs were darker than they appeared in photographs, almost black with age and weather. But as I drew closer, I realized it wasn't just natural weathering. The wood seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating an optical illusion that made the cabin appear to be cut from shadow itself. The door opened at my touch with a prolonged creak that seemed to echo far longer than physics should have allowed. Inside, the air was warmer than it should have been, though I could see no source of heat. My breath fogged only slightly in the dim interior, suggesting a temperature at least 20 degrees warmer than the sub-freezing air outside. And the faces were still on the walls. But there were more of them now, many more. I stood in the doorway for what felt like an eternity, my flashlight beam playing across the carved walls while my mind struggled to process what I was seeing. The photographs from the rescue team's report hadn't captured the true scope of the carving work. Every square inch of available wall space was covered with human faces, layer upon layer of them, as if new ones had been added over decades or perhaps centuries. The craftsmanship was extraordinary and deeply disturbing. Each face was unique, carved with such skill and attention to detail that they seemed almost alive in the wavering beam of my flashlight. I could see the individual pores in their skin, the fine lines around their eyes, the exact texture of their hair. Some faces appeared peaceful, their eyes closed as if in sleep. Others were wide-eyed with terror, their mouths open in silent screams that seemed to echo in the unnatural warmth of the cabin. As I stepped inside, the floorboards creaked beneath my weight with a sound that was almost musical, like the low notes of an enormous pipe organ. The sound seemed to resonate through the walls themselves, and for a moment I could swear I felt the entire structure pulse gently, like a massive heartbeat. I walked the perimeter slowly, forcing myself to document everything methodically despite the growing sense of dread that seemed to thicken with each step. My flashlight beam skimmed over the carved faces, and I began to notice patterns in their arrangement. The peaceful faces were mostly near the floor, while the expressions of horror were concentrated higher up, closer to the ceiling. It was as if the carver had been documenting some kind of progression, a journey from peace to terror that played out across the walls. In the southwestern corner, I found the faces that the rescue team had identified as Sarah Chen and Marcus Rodriguez. The photographs hadn't done justice to the level of detail in their carved features. Sarah's face showed not just horror but a specific kind of dawning realization, as if she'd just understood something terrible about her situation. Marcus appeared to be pleading, his mouth open in what could have been a cry for help or perhaps a scream of denial. But it was what I found on the opposite wall that made my stomach drop into a cold knot of fear. It was my own face, carved with the same impossible attention to detail as all the others. Every feature was exact, down to the small scar on my chin from a childhood accident when I'd fallen off my bicycle onto broken pavement. The carved version of me had the same slightly crooked nose that I'd inherited from my father, the same cowlick that made my hair stand up no matter how much product I used. But the expression on the carved face was wrong. It showed me smiling with a beatific peace that I'd never felt in my life, my eyes closed as if I were experiencing some kind of spiritual ecstasy. It was disturbing not just because it was my face carved into the wall of this cursed place, but because the expression suggested that whatever fate had befallen the others would ultimately be welcomed rather than feared. I don't know why I touched it. Maybe I needed to prove to myself that it was just wood, just an incredibly skilled but ultimately mundane carving. Maybe some part of my mind refused to accept what my eyes were telling me. But the second my fingers brushed against the carved representation of my own face, I felt something that nearly caused me to collapse. The wood pulsed beneath my fingertips with a rhythm that perfectly matched my own heartbeat. The carved face was warm to the touch, warmer than the ambient air in the cabin, and I could swear I felt the faintest movement, as if something was breathing just beneath the surface of the wood. The wall was alive. The realization hit me like a physical blow, and I jerked my hand back as if I'd been burned. But the sensation lingered on my fingertips, that warm, living pulse that suggested something vast and patient dwelling just beneath the surface of the cabin's walls. The floor creaked behind me, a sound distinctly different from the musical groaning I'd heard when I walked. This was the specific creak of someone taking a careful step, trying to move quietly across old floorboards. I spun around, my flashlight beam slicing through the dim interior, but the cabin appeared empty. Still, I could feel a change in the air pressure, a subtle shift that suggested movement nearby. Then the whisper started. At first it was exactly like the voice I'd heard on my radio earlier, soft and buried under layers of what sounded like electronic static. But as I strained to listen, the static faded away and words emerged with crystalline clarity. Stay. Stay here with us. You belong here, Davidson. You've always belonged here. The voice didn't echo off the walls the way a normal voice would in an enclosed space. Instead, it seemed to come from inside the walls themselves, as if the carved faces were speaking in unison, their wooden lips moving just slightly out of sync with the words I was hearing. I backed toward the door, but something was wrong with the cabin's interior dimensions. Each step I took away from the walls seemed to make the room larger rather than bringing me closer to the exit. The doorway, which had been directly behind me when I'd first entered, now seemed impossibly far away, and the rectangle of gray daylight that marked my escape route was shrinking with each passing second. And the faces on the walls were moving. Not dramatically, just the slightest shifts in expression, the barely perceptible movement of eyes tracking my progress across the room. What had been static carvings just moments before were now following my every move with attention that felt almost predatory. The temperature in the cabin was rising. What had been merely warm when I'd entered was now becoming stifling. Sweat began to bead on my forehead despite the sub-freezing temperatures outside, and my winter clothing started to feel like a burden rather than protection. Don't fight it, the chorus of voices whispered from the walls. It's so much easier if you don't fight it. Just let go, Davidson. Let us take care of you. The doorway continued to recede, and panic began to claw at the edges of my consciousness. I was trapped in a room that was somehow larger inside than the cabin's exterior dimensions could possibly allow, surrounded by faces that watched my every move with increasing interest. That's when I noticed the new opening in the eastern wall, a narrow archway that definitely hadn't been there when I'd first entered. The opening was so low that I would have to duck to pass through it, and beyond the threshold lay only darkness that seemed to absorb the beam of my flashlight completely. But it was the only option I could see. The original door had become nothing more than a pinprick of distant light, and the whispers from the walls were growing more insistent, more seductive. I had to move, had to do something other than stand there while whatever inhabited this place slowly closed its trap around me. I ducked through the archway and immediately knew I'd made a terrible mistake. The space beyond the archway was geometrically impossible. It was a perfect square room that felt much larger than the entire cabin I'd just left, with walls that stretched up into darkness beyond the reach of my flashlight. The floor was made of the same dark wood as the exterior walls, but it was polished to a mirror shine that reflected my light beam in strange, prismatic patterns. In the exact center of the room sat a simple wooden chair, its high back carved with the same intricate detail as the faces on the walls. But this carving was different. It showed a progression of human forms, starting with a normal person sitting peacefully and gradually transforming through stages of what looked like metamorphosis until the final figure was something that was no longer entirely human. On the chair sat Thomas Miller. He looked exactly as he had when he'd stumbled into our ranger station that morning after his night in cabin 6, the same frostbitten feet, the same cracked and bleeding lips, the same wild look in his eyes. But he was utterly motionless, sitting with perfect posture in the carved chair, his eyes closed and his lips moving in what appeared to be silent prayer or perhaps conversation with someone I couldn't see. "Miller," I called out, my voice echoing strangely in the cavernous space. His eyes snapped open immediately, focusing on me with an intensity that made me take an involuntary step backward. But when he spoke, his voice carried none of the panicked desperation I remembered from that morning at the station. Instead, he sounded calm, almost serene. "It remembers you now, Davidson," he said, and his smile was the same beatific expression I'd seen carved on my own face back in the main room. "It's been waiting for you for such a long time. Ever since you first started working in this forest, it's been preparing a place for you." Before I could ask what he meant, the walls around us began to shudder. The polished wood floor beneath my feet vibrated with a frequency I could feel in my bones. Long vertical cracks appeared in the walls, running from floor to ceiling like lightning frozen in wood. But these weren't cracks in the conventional sense, they were openings, revealing not the interior structure of the cabin but a darkness so complete it seemed to have physical weight. From those cracks, hands began to emerge. Dozens of them, then hundreds, all reaching into the room with desperate, grasping fingers. They were human hands of every size and description, man, woman, and child, some weathered with age, others smooth with youth. All of them reached toward me with an urgency that spoke of decades or perhaps centuries of patient waiting. Miller stood up from the chair, and for the first time since I'd entered this impossible room, he showed some emotion other than that unsettling serenity. His eyes widened with what looked like genuine concern, though not for me. "No," he said, speaking to the hands rather than to me. "Not yet. It has to be willing. It has to choose." But the hands ignored his plea, reaching farther into the room, some of them stretching impossibly long as they strained toward where I stood. I could hear voices now, whispers emerging from the darkness beyond the cracks, all of them calling my name with the same seductive intimacy I'd heard earlier. Miller bolted for the archway through which I'd entered, moving with surprising speed for someone who'd supposedly been sitting in that chair for weeks. But the moment he reached the threshold, the cabin responded like a living thing. The floorboards beneath his feet split apart with a sound like breaking bones, revealing more of that weight darkness underneath. Miller dropped through the opening up to his waist, the wood closing around him like jaws. His scream was cut off abruptly as the floorboard sealed seamlessly above him, leaving no trace that he'd ever been there at all. The chair in the center of the room was empty again, waiting. The hands reaching from the wall cracks had multiplied, and now they filled nearly half the room's volume. I could feel their fingers brushing against my jacket, my hair, my face, each touch carrying a sensation of desperate hunger that made my skin crawl. The whispers had grown louder too, resolving into individual voices that begged and pleaded and promised relief from all the pain and uncertainty of human existence. Just sit down, they urged. Just rest for a moment. You've been working so hard, carrying so much weight. Let us help you carry it. The chair did look inviting. Despite everything I'd witnessed, despite the impossibility of the situation, part of my mind was beginning to accept the voice's logic. I was tired. I had been carrying weight, the weight of responsibility for protecting people from places like this, the weight of knowledge that some things in the world defied explanation or solution. Maybe it would be easier to just sit down. I took a step toward the chair, and the hands reaching from the walls rustled with anticipation, like leaves stirring in a breeze. The voices grew more encouraging, more seductive. The chair seemed to grow larger as I approached, more comfortable, more welcoming. Another step, and I could feel the wood grain of the floor changing beneath my feet, becoming softer somehow, more yielding. Looking down, I saw that the polished surface was beginning to show the same carved faces that covered the walls of the main cabin. They were emerging from the wood-like figures surfacing from deep water, their expressions peaceful and welcoming. But it was that very peacefulness that snapped me back to awareness. I remembered Sarah Chen's face carved into the main cabin's wall, the expression of dawning horror that had been captured in wood with such perfect detail. I remembered Marcus Rodriguez's pleading expression, the way his carved mouth was open as if he'd died calling for help. And I remembered my own carved face, smiling with a serenity I'd never felt in life. The hands reaching from the walls weren't trying to help me. They were trying to add me to their collection. I ran. Or tried to. Each step felt like I was moving through thick molasses, the air itself seeming to resist my movement. The hands grasped at me from all directions now, not just from the wall cracks but emerging from the floor itself, reaching up through the carved faces that had begun to cover every surface. The archway back to the main cabin seemed to recede with each step I took toward it, pulling away like a mirage in the desert. Behind me, I could hear the chair scraping across the floor as it tried to follow, as if it had developed its own motivation to capture me. The faces in the floor were becoming more animated, their carved mouths opening and closing in what might have been speech or might have been the silent screams of the trapped. Some of them were faces I recognized, not just Sarah and Marcus, but others, dozens of others who must have found their way to this place over the years. All of them had that same expression of final peace, as if whatever had happened to them in their last moments had ultimately been welcome. The walls around the archway were closing in, trying to seal me in the room with the chair and the reaching hands and the promise of eternal rest. I threw myself forward with every ounce of strength I had left, feeling fingers brush against my back as I dove through the narrowing opening. I hit the floor of the main cabin hard, my flashlight skittering away across the wooden planks. Behind me, the archway sealed itself completely, becoming just another section of wall covered in carved faces. But now all the faces were turning to look at me, their wooden eyes tracking my movement as I scrambled to recover my light. The door, the real door that led outside, was still impossibly far away, but it was there. I could see the rectangle of gray daylight that meant escape, that meant the world of logic and reason and things that stayed properly dead when they were supposed to be dead. I ran for it with everything I had left, ignoring the whispers that followed me, ignoring the hands that reached out from every carved face I passed. The floorboards tried to trip me, rising and falling in waves like a wooden sea, but I kept my balance and kept running. I hit the door with my shoulder and burst through into the blessed cold of the winter afternoon. The cabin was silent behind me, looking exactly as innocent and abandoned as it had when I'd first arrived. But I didn't stop running until I was well into the tree line, and I didn't stop looking over my shoulder until I could no longer see the clearing through the thick pine boughs. The hike back to Shadowmere Ranger Station passed in a blur of paranoid glances and stumbling steps. Every tree seemed to be watching me, every shadow held the suggestion of carved faces emerging from bark and stone. My radio had started working again the moment I'd gotten a quarter-mile from the cabin, but I didn't call in. How could I explain what I'd experienced? How could I put into words the impossible geometry of rooms that were larger inside than out, of wooden walls that breathed and pulsed with their own malevolent life? By the time I reached the station parking lot, the sun was setting behind the western peaks, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of orange and red that reminded me uncomfortably of the warm glow that had filled Cabin 6. The other rangers had gone home for the day, leaving the building mostly empty except for the skeleton crew that manned the emergency dispatch center. I locked myself in the equipment storage room at the back of the building, needing a few minutes of solitude to process what had happened before I faced the inevitable debriefing with Chief Mackenzie. My hands were shaking as I pulled off my heavy winter coat, and I could feel cold sweat cooling on my skin despite the building's warmth. The storage room had a small sink in one corner, installed years ago for cleaning equipment, and above it hung a cheap mirror that was usually too dusty to show a clear reflection. But someone had cleaned it recently, and as I leaned over the sink to splash cold water on my face, I caught sight of something in the glass that made my blood freeze in my veins. The reflection staring back at me had my eyes, my mouth, my slightly crooked nose and the scar on my chin from that childhood bicycle accident. But there was something fundamentally wrong with it, something that my conscious mind struggled to process even as every instinct screamed warnings. The wood grain was there, running through my reflected skin like veins of darker material beneath the surface. Fine lines of bark texture traced patterns across my cheeks and forehead, and my eyes had taken on the same flat, carved appearance as the faces on Cabin 6 walls. And the reflection was smiling, the same beatific, peaceful smile I'd seen on my carved face back in that cursed place, an expression of serenity that I definitely wasn't feeling. I jerked away from the mirror, stumbling backward until I hit the storage room's far wall. When I looked back, the mirror showed only normal reflection, tired, shaken, but undeniably human. No wood grain, no carved features, just my own face wearing an expression of barely controlled terror. But the smile had lingered for just a moment too long, hanging in the glass like an afterimage of something that shouldn't exist. I pulled out my cell phone with trembling fingers and activated the camera, turning it toward my face to check for any visible signs of the transformation I'd seen in the mirror. The phone screen showed only my normal appearance, but as I watched, the image flickered for just a frame or two, showing something else, something with my features but carved from dark wood, smiling that terrible peaceful smile. I dropped the phone, and it clattered across the storage room floor, the screen going dark. Outside the storage room, I could hear the normal sounds of the ranger station at night, dispatch radios crackling with routine calls, the coffee maker gurgling in the break room, someone's boots echoing down the hallway. All the comfortable, mundane sounds of the world I'd always known, the world of forms and procedures and problems that could be solved with equipment and training and common sense. But underneath those normal sounds, so faint I might have been imagining it, I could hear something else. A whisper, barely audible even in the storage room's silence, calling my name with the same seductive intimacy I'd heard in Cabin 6. "Davidson, come home, Davidson, we're waiting for you." I pressed my hands over my ears, but the whisper didn't fade. If anything, it seemed to grow clearer, as if blocking out the external sounds only made it easier to hear the voice that was coming from inside my own head. Or perhaps from something that was slowly becoming part of me. I stayed in that storage room for 3 hours, checking and rechecking my reflection in every reflective surface I could find. Sometimes I looked normal. Sometimes the wood grain was there, faint but unmistakable. And always, there was that smile hovering at the edges of my expression, waiting to take over completely. When Chief Mackenzie finally found me there, curled up in the corner among boxes of emergency flares and first aid supplies, I tried to tell him what had happened. I tried to explain about the impossible rooms and the reaching hands and the way my own face had been carved into the wall with an expression I'd never worn. He listened patiently, nodding in all the right places, his weathered face showing nothing but professional concern. But I could see it in his eyes, the same look I'd probably given other rangers over the years when they came back from difficult assignments with stories that didn't quite make sense. "You've been under a lot of stress lately," he said finally. "Why don't you take some time off? A week or two, maybe longer. Get some rest, maybe see someone to talk things through." I wanted to argue, wanted to grab him by the shoulders and make him understand that this wasn't stress or exhaustion or any other rational explanation. But when I caught sight of my reflection in the storage room's small mirror, I saw that I was smiling that peaceful, carved smile, and the words died in my throat. "Yeah," I heard myself say, though I hadn't consciously decided to speak. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I do need some rest." Mackenzie looked relieved. "Take all the time you need, Davidson. Your job will be waiting for you when you're ready to come back." But even as he spoke, I could see the doubt in his eyes. He was already wondering if I'd ever be fit for duty again, already making mental notes about finding my replacement. And the terrible thing was, he was probably right to wonder. Because as I walked out of that storage room and through the ranger station's main office, I could feel something changing inside me. With each step, the whispers grew a little clearer, a little more persuasive. The wood grain patterns that flickered in and out of my reflection were becoming more pronounced, more permanent. And most terrifying of all, I was beginning to find them beautiful. The drive home passed in a haze of streetlights and stop signs and all the normal landmarks of a life I was starting to feel disconnected from. My apartment, when I finally reached it, seemed smaller than I remembered, less real somehow. The furniture looked like props in a play, the photographs on the walls like images of strangers I'd once known but could barely remember. I stood in my bathroom, staring at my reflection in the medicine cabinet mirror, watching the wood grain patterns grow more distinct with each passing hour. By midnight, they covered nearly half my face. By dawn, they would probably be complete. And I found that I didn't mind. The whispers from cabin 6 had followed me home, growing stronger as the night. I don't go near Devil's Throat Trail after dark anymore. Not since that night. It's just a stretch of backcountry like any other, ancient Douglas firs that blot out the moon, treacherous switchbacks carved into the mountainside, and Widow's Creek that runs black as tar even in daylight. The old-timers called it Devil's Throat because of how the ravine narrows into a stone gullet that seems to swallow sound itself. But if you venture there after sundown, sometimes you'll hear it. The screaming. Not just one voice, a whole congregation of the damned, howling in unison like they're being flayed alive by invisible hands. It rises from the canyon depths like smoke from hell's chimney, echoing off the granite walls until it becomes something more than human terror, something primordial and wrong. It's not coyotes. It's not mountain lions. It's not the wind through the rock formations, no matter what the district supervisor claims in his reports. It's not anything alive. 3 summers ago, I was on night patrol, driving the old logging road that snakes along Serpent's Ridge above Devil's Throat Trail. The locals avoid that road after dark, crossing themselves when they pass the rusted gate that marks the forest boundary. It was mid-July, clear skies stretched thin as parchment, no wind to stir the suffocating air. The kind of night where the forest feels like it's holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to break the silence. That's when dispatch crackled through the radio with a complaint from a group of campers, said they'd set up at Deadman's Clearing down by Widow's Creek and heard something unholy coming from the trees. They'd tried to pack up and flee, but the noise was so overwhelming, so bone-deep terrifying, they were paralyzed with fear. The voice on the radio was Linda Martinez, our night dispatcher for 15 years. I'd never heard her voice shake before that call. It took me 40 minutes of white-knuckled driving to navigate the switchbacks down to the trailhead. When I finally reached Deadman's Clearing, their campfire was still burning, casting dancing shadows that seemed to reach too far into the surrounding darkness. 3 dome tents still pitched in a perfect triangle around the flames, camping chairs arranged as if the occupants had simply vanished mid-conversation. But the campsite was empty. Empty except for the smell, something sweet and cloying that made my stomach churn, like flowers left too long in standing water. And then I heard it, distant at first, like the memory of screams echoing across Serpent's Ridge. The sound that would haunt my dreams for years to come. Not panicked shouts for help, not the desperate calls of lost hikers, this was pure, distilled terror-given voice. It was layered and overlapping like a hellish choir, dozens of voices crying out in unison, their agony harmonizing into something that made my skin crawl and my teeth ache. The sound was rising from the direction of Widow's Creek, where the canyon walls narrow into that throat-like passage the old-timers feared. I should have called for backup right then. Should have retreated to my truck and waited for the state police. The smart play would have been to cordon off the area and let someone else deal with whatever nightmare had consumed those campers. Instead, I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight and my service weapon, and stepped into the hungry darkness of Devil's Throat Trail. The trail down to Widow's Creek was a nightmare of loose shale and gnarled roots, the kind of path that seemed designed to break ankles and split skulls. The mud wasn't ordinary trail mud, it was black and viscous, clinging to my boots like it had a will of its own, trying to drag me deeper into the earth with each laborious step. My flashlight beam trembled with every movement, cutting weak paths through the oppressive darkness. Not from the treacherous terrain, but from the adrenaline flooding my system, the primal part of my brain screaming at me to run. I called out into the abyss, "Park Ranger. This is Ranger Hale. Is anyone out there?" My voice echoed off the canyon walls, distorting and multiplying until it sounded like a dozen rangers calling into the void. The echoes stretched on far longer than they should have, bouncing between the stone faces of Devil's Throat until they became something unrecognizable. No human answer came back. Just the steady, sinister trickle of Widow's Creek somewhere in the lightless depths below, and, threading through the darkness like poison through veins, the screams again. This time they weren't distant memories carried on phantom winds. They were behind me. I spun around so violently that my flashlight beam carved wild, desperate arcs through the towering pines, catching glimpses of bark scarred by decades of storms, branches that twisted into claw-like shapes, and empty air that somehow felt occupied. No movement, no telltale eyeshine reflecting back at me. But the sound was there, not just louder now, but closer, more intimate, like a dozen tortured souls were whispering their final agonies directly into my skull. The screaming stopped all at once, cut off mid-wail as if someone had slammed a door on hell itself. Dead silence crashed down like a physical weight. I didn't realize I'd been holding my breath until my chest began to burn, my lungs desperate for air that tasted of fear and decay. That's when I noticed the first tent through the trees below. Even from this distance, I could see it was still zipped tight, the nylon walls intact. But as my beam found it fully, the damage became clear, the fabric was shredded in precise, deliberate places. Not the random tears of bare claws or the messy destruction of a panicked animal. These looked like something inside had methodically tried to claw its way out, leaving behind geometric patterns of destruction that hurt to look at directly. I half slid, half fell down the remaining slope to reach it, my boots finally finding purchase on the rocky shore of Widow's Creek. The water moved wrong, too slow, too thick, like oil pretending to be a mountain stream. Kneeling beside the damaged tent, I shined my light through the largest tear in the fabric. The sleeping bags inside were soaked, but not with creek water or rain from the clear night sky. This liquid was dark and viscous, clinging to the nylon like congealed blood. It had a smell that made my gorge rise, sweet corruption mixed with something metallic that coated my tongue. A second tent sat 10 feet downstream, collapsed entirely under the weight of something I couldn't identify. Underneath the flattened nylon, a backpack lay split open, its contents scattered across the rocky ground, a flashlight with batteries so corroded they'd leaked acid, a topographical map of Devil's Throat Trail with dead men's clearings circled in what looked like dried blood, and a disposable camera with most of its film used. I pocketed the camera with trembling fingers, telling myself I'd developed the film back at the ranger station, that whatever these people had photographed might explain what happened to them. That's when the screaming came again, not from one direction this time, but surrounding me completely, rising from both sides of the canyon as if the very walls of Devil's Throat were giving voice to some ancient torment. I turned to retreat back up the trail I'd just ascended, but the path I'd walked moments before was gone, erased as thoroughly as if it had never existed. The trail I'd just ascended was gone, not blocked by fallen trees, not obscured by sudden undergrowth, completely absent, as if the mountain itself had swallowed it in the few minutes I'd spent examining the destroyed campsite. I swept my flashlight beam frantically across the canyon wall where the path should have been. Nothing. Not even the scuff marks my boots had left in the shale, not even the broken branches I'd pushed aside. The stone face rose smooth and unbroken, as if it had been carved by some impossible force. Dispatch, this is Ranger Hale. I'm at Devil's Throat Trail, Deadman's Clearing. The campsite's abandoned, but I'm hearing. Static exploded from my radio, not the weak signal static you get in mountain country, but something alive and malicious, drowning out my words like hungry water rushing into lungs. Then, threaded through the electronic chaos like a snake through tall grass, I heard it, come down to the water. The words repeated in an endless loop, spoken in voices that might once have been human but had been stretched and distorted beyond recognition. I moved toward Widow's Creek, each step feeling like I was walking deeper into a trap that had been set long before I was born. My boots sank into the wet ground with wet sucking sounds, and I realized the earth here wasn't normal soil, it was soft and yielding, like walking on a bed of rotting flesh. The canyon walls seemed wrong now, they'd grown taller and leaned inward while I wasn't looking, creating a stone ceiling that pressed down like the roof of a tomb. The angles were impossible, defying every law of geology I'd learned in my forestry training. And then I saw the fire through the trees ahead. Not the normal campfire from the abandoned site, this was further downstream where Widow's Creek disappeared into the narrow throat of the canyon. A small circle of flames that burned white as bone, casting no warmth and throwing shadows that moved independently of their sources. Around the unholy fire stood the campers. At least, they had to be the missing campers. 4 figures in the remnants of hiking gear, motionless as cemetery statues, facing inward toward the pale flames. Their clothes hung in tatters, and their hair was plastered to their skulls with something dark and wet. Their mouths gaped open as if frozen mid-scream, but no sound emerged from those black caverns. I called out to them, my voice cracking with strain, "Hey! Are you okay? I'm a park ranger." No reaction. They might as well have been carved from stone. As I forced myself to step closer, fighting every instinct that screamed at me to run, the ground shifted beneath my feet. I looked down in growing horror, and realized I wasn't standing on the rocky shore of Widow's Creek anymore. I was standing on a graveyard of camping equipment. Dozens of tents lay half buried in the soft earth, their nylon walls rotting and split, zippers green with corrosion. Some still held shapes inside them, lumpy, unnatural forms that might once have been human. The canvas was old, some of it dating back decades based on the faded colors and obsolete designs. How many campers had vanished in Devil's Throat over the years? How many missing persons reports had been filed and forgotten? The white flames hissed like angry serpents, and all 4 campers turned to face me in perfect synchronization. Their eyes were solid black from lid to lid, reflecting the ghostly fire like pools of oil. They began moving toward me with mechanical precision, their feet dragging through the soft ground in unison. I backed toward the creek's edge, my flashlight beam jumping frantically between their approaching forms, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. That's when I noticed their legs weren't bending the way human legs should. The knees pushed backward with every step, joints popping and crackling, like their bones had been systematically broken and reset in impossible configurations. I bolted for the water's edge, hoping to find another way out of this nightmare canyon. Widow's Creek was no longer the lazy mountain stream I'd seen from above. The water was churning and roiling, bubbling like a pot over an invisible flame. The screaming I'd been hearing all night was rising from beneath the surface, dozens of voices crying out from the depths, their agonized wails distorted by the black water. Something pale broke the surface near the far bank, a hand, but wrong in every detail. The fingers were too long, stretched like taffy, with nails that curved into razor-sharp points. Another hand erupted from the water nearby, then another, until the entire creek seemed to be reaching for me with grasping, hungry appendages. A face followed the hands to the surface, if it could be called a face. It was a nightmare amalgamation of features that might once have belonged to different people, stitched together into something that defied sanity. The mouth stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of teeth like broken glass. I stumbled backward just as the thing launched itself from the water with inhuman strength. Its clawed hands slammed into the rocky bank where I'd been standing, missing my ankles by mere inches and leaving gouges in the stone. The four campers continued their relentless advance, their black eyes never blinking, never wavering from my face. I don't remember drawing my service weapon, but I remember the muzzle flash illuminating the canyon walls in stark detail. The sound of gunshots echoed endlessly between the stone faces of Devil's Throat, multiplying into a thunderous cacophony. When the afterimages cleared from my retinas, I was alone. The bone-white fire had vanished, the campers had disappeared like smoke, and the thing in Widow's Creek had sunk back into its black depths. I ran through the darkness until my lungs felt like they were full of broken glass, stumbling over rocks and fallen logs, branches tearing at my clothes and face. Behind me, the screaming resumed, but now it sounded like pursuit, like a pack of invisible predators giving chase. When I finally reached the top of the canyon, gasping and bleeding, my ranger truck was gone from where I'd parked it at the trailhead. The keys were still in my pocket. I made it back to the ranger station on foot just as dawn was breaking over Serpent's Ridge, my uniform torn and my hands shaking so badly I could barely open the door. The other rangers found me in the break room, staring at nothing and muttering about things in the water. They told me there hadn't been any campers registered for Devil's Throat Trail in over 2 months. The complaint call that brought me there. No record of it in the dispatch log. Linda Martinez had been on vacation for a week. I had the disposable camera developed at the 1-hour photo place in town, my hands trembling as I opened the envelope. Most of the shots were innocent enough, typical camping photos of the group setting up at Deadman's Clearing, posed shots around their fire, candid moments of laughter and friendship. But the last photo, taken in the dead of night with a flash that shouldn't have been powerful enough to reach so far, showed 4 people standing around a circle of white flames. In the background, half visible in the black water of Widow's Creek, something with too many limbs was crawling onto the shore. I resigned from the Park Service the next week. But last night, 3 months after I'd moved to a cabin 50 miles from Devil's Throat Trail, I woke to the sound of screaming outside my window. It was coming from the drainage ditch behind my house, a concrete channel that carries runoff from the mountain during heavy rains. The same mountain where Widow's Creek begins.